Hey everyone, if you're new here, you probably haven't seen this conversation Abdullah Gondal and I had with this very interesting character. His name is Hasan Azad, a PhD at Columbia, and he calls himself a Sufi Christian. We conversed with him back in 2019. At the time, he was happy to talk, but after the conversation with me and Gondal, at some point after that, he got mad and called me an Islamophobe who benefits off anti-Muslim hatred and blocked me. He said, "Maybe you're right, Abdullah Samir. Maybe I need to lighten up. At the same time, let's not pretend that Facebook or social media is utterly inconsequential, not least considering you have built something of a career by precisely utilizing Facebook as far as promoting, I'm sorry to say, anti-Muslim hatred, and consciously or unconsciously fueling anti-Muslim statements." Interesting. I won't reply to his accusations here since I have a whole article on this, but I was kind of shocked because in this very conversation I asked him what he thought about what we do, and he didn't quite answer. In fact, I in particular asked him whether he thought what we were doing was connected to Islamophobia. This would have been the perfect opportunity to discuss this, but instead he didn't. He attacked me on Facebook. His views were all over the place. He's a Muslim who became Christian, which says he's both Muslim and Christian. Very strange. Anyways, this was an interesting conversation, and you'll get to see Abdullah Samir and Abdullah Gondal 6 years younger, maybe they're much greener, and still just getting into this. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Keep in mind, this was many years ago, and Hassan may have changed his positions. We haven't talked since. And also, be charitable, as we were quite young as well. I give you the two Abdullahs talking to Christian Muslim Hasan Azad. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. Let's get into it.
And hello, everyone. This is Abdullah Samir. I'm joined by two special guests today. I have Abdullah Gondal, who you guys all know or might know from, it's been a while since we had a last conversation, and he's an ex-Muslim atheist just like myself. And we have Hasan Azad. Hasan Azad is a student, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Religion at Columbia. And
I already have my PhD. Actually.
Oh, congratulations!
I've had it for over a year now. But
awesome!
I'm
going by some outdated bio I found online.
That's probably Al Jazeera, right? Al Jazeera, that's like an old article. But anyway,
So Hassan approached Abdullah Gondal about having this conversation, and so we thought it would be a good idea, and it would be nice to kind of have a little bit of back and forth and talk about, religion, atheism, Christianity. Abdullah Gondal, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Just been busy with life, so it's good to be back.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very excited about this conversation because, seeing that Hassan has a PhD in one of the most interesting subjects to me, that is Islam. And then, interestingly, he's left Islam, but he's joined Christianity. So, I'm just looking forward to it. Plus, he specializes in Islamophobia, and he actually wrote a paper on Hizb ut-Tahrir. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And we exchanged a few words just before we started, and I'm pumped up. So I'll hand it back over to Hassan now to take over.
Oh, likewise. And I'm sort of also excited about this conversation, and I'm looking forward to lively discussion. And let's. These are important topics, right? These are topics that aren't going away anytime soon.
So, Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the principle that I come from is that as human beings, as thinking, living, breathing beings, we owe it to ourselves first and foremost, and to each other to appreciate where we're all coming from, regardless of our backgrounds, right? And we're necessarily going to disagree. There aren't two people under the sun, as far as I'm concerned, who agree on everything. That's just what it means to be human. And I think the interesting work can be done as intelligent people, as thinking people, when we can see the different positions we're coming from, and sort of not necessarily agree, but come to an appreciation of why we differ on some key things sometimes.
Yeah, and to begin, why do you have a Ganesh statue if you're Christian?
Yeah, I mean, this is partly to throw people off, but also truthfully, it's I'm a student of religion, as such. I've studied religion, philosophy, and so forth for over 20 years now. I personally have benefited tremendously from studying all the traditions, not least of all the Hindu tradition, from which I derive a lot of intellectual and spiritual sustenance. Yeah, I'm a complicated cat. So
So let's talk about to begin. There's a really interesting topic which I want to ask you. I don't know if we should do this now or if it'll get into too many other things, which is why you don't use ex-Muslim label. But let's leave that for now. Leave that for now, and let's talk about. Can you just briefly tell us how you ended up going from Islam to Christianity? I do have a few friends. I know a few people, but it's not that. Maybe I just don't know the right people, but it doesn't seem to happen as. Yeah, it is very. It seems to be very uncommon compared to becoming atheist.
Yeah. So I come from a Muslim background, born and raised, was practicing Sufi for 15 plus years. Was very comfortable in my Sufi Islam, however I understood it. And there was no question for me to, I had a deep appreciation of the different traditions, not least of all Christianity. At the same time, there was never any question of my converting until in 2016, Easter of 2016, I was attending a Methodist church, and I felt called, compelled, however we phrase it, I felt called to take communion. I took communion and I experienced Christ. And since then, I have, tried to practice the Christian tradition. I found Eastern Orthodoxy soon thereafter. I'm an ordained reader in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. So I really know how to choose, I really know how to choose the right from Islam to Eastern Russian Orthodoxy. It's like if one said, you're being calculating, it's like my calculations are completely off, right? Considering how Russia's demonized today. But anyway, in any case, I don't think I personally don't think I'm being calculating. But so I self-identify as Orthodox Christian and Sufi at the same time, and I'm inspired by all the traditions, to be honest.
Would you consider yourself as a Muslim at the same time as believing in?
Yeah, I think this is an important question, and it's a question that I grapple with on a daily basis, believe it or not, because my intellectual, spiritual formation certainly happened in the Islamic tradition, and I have a deep appreciation of the Islamic tradition. As far as I'm concerned, the Islamic tradition is a deeply transformative tradition in positive ways. The Islamic tradition provides for me still, even though I'm very, I have a deep, these groundings, they take a lifetime ultimately, but I'm a reader in the Eastern Orthodox Church, so that's not a small thing. It's essentially, it's the first rung towards becoming a priest. Whether I become a priest or not, only God knows. But which is to say, it's not a small thing. Nevertheless, I make sense of the world still through a type of Islamic metaphysics. So I believe I believe in the reality of Christ, just as I believe in the in the reality of the Quranic message, just as I believe in the reality of the the Hindu metaphysical traditions. just as much as I believe in the duality of the Buddhist tradition. So it's complicated. I honestly don't have, literally this is something I think about on a daily basis, and I have yet to come to a clear-cut conclusion as far as definitional self labels are concerned. I don't have a clear label for myself.
So since we know like these religions are very mutually exclusive, for example, like Islam is
Right.
like Christ isn't the Son of God, and
Right.
really clear words in the Quran about that, right?
Right.
And with polytheism and Islam not mixing, or Christianity not mixing.
Right.
So would you consider like Muhammad the prophet, or would you consider him like a reformer of his time, trying to find the truth like one of us?
Yeah. So to your first position about the religions being mutually exclusive, I think the religions in their external forms are clearly they're clearly very different, right? Ganesh does not look like Christ on the cross, right? Christ on the cross clearly does not look like the Arabic calligraphy of Allah, right? To use those symbols, the Islamic prayer does not look or sound anything like taking communion on Sunday as a Christian. At the same time, I not only believe, I know this in the core of my being. I mean, I have a very sort of unusual, and as I keep harping on about this because perhaps it bears repeating. I mean, I'm very unusual in that I have an insider's perspective, especially, certainly, both as a Muslim and a Christian. And I'm sure there are other people like me, but I mean, historically, I know of historic examples. I don't know. I actually literally don't know of any contemporary examples today. Which is not to make some big claim. It's just it's very unusual, I guess, is my point. All of that is to say that having practiced Islam from, seen Islam from within, having seen Christianity from within, my profound belief and sense and conviction, it's beyond conviction, it's beyond some rational sort of, it's like, a deep understanding that I have within, is that each of these traditions are absolutely valid means for us to experience something of the transcendent in our lives. So from that perspective, the traditions, from a deep sort of inner from a deeper sort of metaphysical point of view, the traditions I don't see as being mutually exclusive at all. If anything, I really believe, and this is what I've learned from my teachers, some of whose names I could mention to you, but I really believe that the traditions in their innermost realities, they confirm one another. And this has been actually historically the case as well. Some of the greatest sages throughout the ages, whether Christian, whether Muslim, whether Hindu, whether Buddhist, they actually confirmed one another, each other's, the truth of each other's positionalities, which is something that most people don't realize. There's very limited appreciation of that reality. Yeah.
Sorry, Hassan. There's a bit of noise coming from the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I was just gonna say, like, I agree with Abdullah Gondal in a sense that, like, it from the primary texts of all of these holy books, they do appear to be mutually exclusive. Right. Now, I know that you were, as a Sufi, you're basically, your position, you're a perennialist. Is that correct? So you believe that all of these religions lead to God, lead to the same reality, ultimate reality. That's your position?
Right. So I think the very common metaphor that's used, one hears this all the time, sees this all the time, is, if we consider the individual traditions to be paths on a mountain, right, leading to the same summit, then ultimately all the paths lead to the same reality, right?
Yeah, but sorry, your mic is still making noise because
I'm sorry.
yeah.
Is it because I'm holding it?
Yeah, yeah.
So, maybe I should let go.
Yes, now it's good.
Okay.
So, but it seemed like for example, Hinduism says that there's reincarnation, and Hinduism is all about the philosophers' wisdom as they came up with the ancient sages, and they were trying their best to come up with ancient wisdom. Christianity, the official doctrine of Christianity says that you have to accept Jesus died for your sins in order to be saved, in order for salvation. And Islam says that whoever disbelieves in Muhammad after knowing about Muhammad and rejects Muhammad will go to, will be in the fire of hell, because Muhammad is one of the major signs of the Day of Judgment. So any Christian, I mean, you're obviously coming at it from a very non-orthodox perspective, whereas most Christians I know considered Muhammad to be one of the greatest devils of all time. Like, he is the biggest false prophet that came after Jesus, and Jesus was a Messiah. Whereas in Islam, Islam says very different things about Jesus, that he was not killed on the cross and he did not die for anyone's sins, and no bearer of burden will bear the sins of another. Whereas in Christianity, there's original sin, and there's this sort of like heavy debt on humanity that has to be paid off by this great sacrifice that the only begotten Son of God is. So I don't, like, from a distance, I don't see how these religions are compatible, or how you can make them all play nicely together.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's not a simple exercise, and it's certainly not an exercise that most people would appreciate or be happy with. The majority of Muslims possibly would not be appreciative of it. The majority of Christians would not be appreciative of it. At the same time, the reality is, the historic reality is, right? I mean, to go back to some of your phrasing, which, not to pick on it, but I think it's indicative, right? It's illustrative. You said that Islam says, right, or Christianity says.
Or the primary texts of Islam, let's say, the Quran.
Right. Well, so the thing is, there's no, even with the Quran, right? The Quran does not exist without a community of interpreters. Throughout history, these texts have always been interpreted by groups of people, men and women, and so we have a multiplicity of interpretations. In the Sunni tradition, we have what they call the idea of
Mujtahid,
Mujtahid, I was thinking of. I think I just blanked on that. Anyway, so I'm sort of getting messages right now that's sort of distracting me a little bit. So I apologize. Which anyway, so something that in the academy, I studying religion as such, or religions in the plural, Islam not least of all. One of the benefits of studying Islam from the vantage point of the academy is one very quickly learns to appreciate that there's never been one Islam through history. There's never been one Christianity through history. Mm-hmm. This applies to all the traditions.
But they're different religions, right? Like, Christianity is one religion, Islam is one religion, and I don't mean to say there's only one version or interpretation or way of like understanding Islam. I definitely am not saying that. I'm not trying to say like Wahhabi Islam is the only Islam or something like that. But these are the primary kind of like doctrines of Islam. Yeah. There is only one God. Jesus is not the Son of God. And the Quran like the Quran uses the most harsh language. Those who say Jesus is the Son of God, they will be in hell forever. And they will be those and the idols that they worship will be stones for the fire. And then of course someone asked one of the scholars, well, does that mean Jesus is going to be in hell because they worship Jesus? He said, no, not Jesus himself, because Jesus was a righteous man. But like to me, perennialism, it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't match the texts. That's what I feel. It does. Like if God wanted us to all be one religion, then why would he send one? It doesn't click to me.
Well, to that the last portion of your very question, from a Muslim point of view, right, from a believer's point of view, God actually says in the Quran, had he so willed, he could have made people of one faith, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a divine wisdom. Look, I guess the point is, how do we read the Quran, right? How do we say to ourselves, this is what Islam says, right? And this is an open-ended question. If I may just very quickly finish the thought, Gondal, I can sense that you're looking to come in. But very quickly, the Quran is a text, right? It's a religious text from a Muslim point of view that is meant to be understood as a whole, right? And it's meant to be understood in relation to the hadith traditions, in relation to the historic Islamic intellectual tradition itself. I don't think, there's a reason why when one takes a beginner's, an introductory course on Islam, there's a reason why they say, there are 5 pillars, right? But then it sort of expands out beyond that, right? To say that there have been historically very serious Muslim scholars, and I'm not saying this has been the dominant position, right? But this position has existed. One of my own teachers, Martin Lings, who is a British convert to Islam, he wrote the
Muhammad,
Seerah of the Prophet. He was a phenomenal scholar in his own right. Phenomenal. In his own lifetime, he never advertised the fact that he was Muslim, but he was one of the most saintly men that I've ever met in my entire life, without question. He, for example, points out in the Seerah, the life of Muhammad that he writes in English, which is subsequently translated into Arabic and other languages. He writes about how, and this is a problem that Muslims and otherwise have to deal with. I say problem in quotation marks. Like this is something we have to grapple with. That why is it that the Prophet, and this is a question that I'm posing, Martin Lings makes this point in his seerah, the factual point, which is that when the Prophet commands his companions to cleanse the Kaaba of the idols, right, after he takes over Mecca, he commands that all the idols are removed and destroyed except an icon of Christ and the Virgin, which is a very fascinating historic fact, right?
Yeah, Hamza Yusuf actually criticized that.
Right, no, Hamza Yusuf doesn't know what he's talking about. Because no, he doesn't. No, because subsequently, no, he really doesn't. I mean, Hamza Yusuf, if you compare Hamza Yusuf to Martin Lings, Martin Lings was, head and shoulders above Hamza Yusuf. I know Hamza Yusuf, I remember hearing that, the commentary that he did many, many years ago, and subsequently it has been shown, I even saw an article more recently, that this hadith tradition exists. It's not made up. The fact that the Prophet Muhammad is taken, when he receives his first revelation by Khadija, his wife, to meet Waraka, right, Khadija's uncle, who's a Christian monk, and he confirms. So historically, from the very outset, the lines of demarcation are not so as clear and rigid as we tend to think as modern subjects. The lines between the religions historically were always porous, much more porous than they've become in recent times. And this is a fact that scholars write endlessly about in the academy. And part of the reason, one of the serious motivations behind my originally reaching out to you guys and having this conversation today is to share some of the knowledge that is kind of everyday knowledge in the academy, but is unknown beyond the academy.
Okay. Abdullah Gondal, you want to respond?
Yeah, so just a few things. I totally agree that there should not be one interpretation of religion. Like,
Yes.
definitely, like you cannot say that, oh, Islam is just Wahhabi Islam or ISIS version of Islam. That's
Right.
not. Islam exists in many different shapes and forms and sizes. And
Yes.
like the issue I see first is the predominant view of Sunni Muslims is they want to stick to the hadith that say that hold on to the Quran and the hadith and the sunnah of the caliphs and the first few generations. So they have this image that Islam has to be purely how Muhammad and his companions saw it. Whereas that's not true, because every religion, like I see it, evolves with its followers, and it, as a tradition, should encompass like thousands of years of accumulative knowledge, right? So that's the way I see it, and I totally agree with you in that sense. Now, what I've noticed so far is there needs to be a more fundamental question asked, is like, how do you value or view scripture? For example, like, a normal Muslim would say that the Quran is the literal speech of God, right? Like an average person. Or like a Christian will say like the Bible is the inspired word of God. Now, as a perennialist, then you have implications in the sense that why would God dedicate such a large portion of his book to this on the other religions?
Right.
Same
That's a good
time.
point.
So, for example, like there's a very, very large portion of the Quran that is dedicated to calling unbelievers all sorts of insults, like worse than animals, like animals, donkeys.
No, worse. Right. Ultimately,
Yeah,
yeah.
like all
Right,
sorts
right.
of names.
Right.
And
Yes,
then
yes.
in Christianity, like if you look at the Bible, even in the New Testament, like verses about blasphemy being like the biggest sin against the spirit that could never be forgiven.
Right.
Or if, for example, in Leviticus, it also says that if you hear anybody mention or talk about a different god, you're supposed to gather him in the city and stone him to death.
Yeah.
Or even if it be your own son, if he disobeys you, stuff like this, right? So when you see the text itself,
Yeah,
it's really hard to reconcile it like with a perennial philosophy.
sure.
So
Yeah. Mhm.
that's what I'm interested in. Like, how do you see this disconnect between the text and then the interpretation that is being derived from it?
Yeah. So, and there's a lot there, right? So it's not. There are few portions.
Let's start by like, what's your belief about scripture and revelation?
Yeah. Right. So.
So do you believe that these books are actually
Okay, so I
from
think
God?
right. So I think would have to take it point
One by one, yeah.
because I mean, someone actually, a friend of mine was saying, I feel like it's unfair that, because I mean, this is a discussion, and this is how we discussed we would be doing it, and at the same time, it's something of a debate. So a friend was like, "Oh, I think it's unfair that you have two people debating here." And I said, "No, I actually wanted this because I wanted something of a challenge, and if we can be just for the sake of practical, for practical reasons, if we can, take person by person and point by point."
Yeah.
So the question of scripture, the way I understand it, if we take the Quran first and foremost, the Quran is a window onto reality, right? It's a mechanism. It's a way for us to make sense of reality, which is ultimately, reality itself with a capital R can never be exhausted, right? The Quran provides us with a means for making sense of reality. And if we boil down the Quran to its fundamental message, which is not, to be fair, right? I mean, you guys, I think, would agree with me that the fundamental message of the Quran is not, go kill the disbelievers. The fundamental message is that God, He, She, It, this divine reality has given rise to everything we see around us. If I can finish the thought.
Yep, sure.
That all of creation is ultimately a Quran, a bigger Quran. It's the cosmic Quran that we have to. So the Quran in the Islamic consciousness, right, is a book of signs, right? It's understood as a book of signs. When we read these signs, when we interpret these signs, when we come to a realization. The same thing with the cosmic Quran, which is when we read the signs, right? Signs point to something beyond themselves. That everything around us, all of creation, right, from the flower to the stars in the heavens, and everything in between and below, points to the fundamental reality of a divine reality. There's a divine reality behind all of existence. That to exist, so the Shahada, right, the Islamic profession of faith, La ilaha illallah, there's no God with a lowercase g, but God with a capital G, right? Many Sufis will sort of reread that to make a point, to say that there is no reality with a lowercase r except reality with an uppercase r, right? That all of existence. So this is the fundamental message of the Quran, and everything else is secondary, really, as far as I can tell. And I've thought a lot about this, and this is what I've learned from my teachers, that ultimately this is the fundamental message. Everything else is secondary to that.
Okay. So to me, this seems like there's two things being conflated here. Now, one thing being that why does religion exist or how it originated versus
right.
different religions being created by different people to explain reality in their sense of the world.
Yeah.
The way I see it is like religion was a sincere effort by our ancestors, driven by human curiosity to actually sincerely figure out what's going on in the universe, right? And with their limited knowledge and the age and the time they were living in, they tried their very best to make sense of things, Obviously, some things they got right, some things they got wrong. So I definitely agree, like the end motive of religion was to answer the fundamental, the existential question of why are we here, who created us, what to worship or what God to worship. But every tribe or culture or nation has their own understanding of how to get to that point, right?
Yeah.
Understand that you're coming from an inclusive perspective, that all religions are trying to get to the same goal, yes. But whilst in that journey to get to that goal, they severely contradict each other in the most fundamental ideas. For example, like the idea of God being 1, 2, 3 millions, or do we even need to worship a God? Does God need worship? And then
I think that's a very fair criticism, and I would respond to that criticism by saying the following. So one of the greatest minds, certainly that the Islamic tradition has produced, if not ever produced in all of human history. So he's certainly one of them. He's considered in the Islamic tradition Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi, who also has the odd I can't think of the word right now, but many consider him to be the greatest of people who's misguided at the same time. So he's a fascinating, very interestingly enough, divisive character, and hugely influential, immensely influential throughout Islamic intellectual history. Post Ibn Arabi, it's any sort of Islamic metaphysics necessarily goes through him, the majority of it. He sort of has this idea which is deeply unsettling and at the same time deeply insightful, which is that he says on the Day of Judgment, he has this idea of the personal God, that each and every one of us, by virtue of our unique constellation of the divine names within us. So on this, I'd have to speak a little more about that, but without going into too much detail, but essentially each and every one of us is uniquely constituted. There isn't another Abdullah Gondal in the world. We know this factually, but we forget, right, all the time. And There isn't another Abdullah Samir, there isn't another Hasan Azad, etc., etc. So my understanding of reality, right, whatever I call it, if I call it God, if I call it the universe, what have you, is going to be uniquely my own. To take a theistic point of view, which Ibn Arabi does, on the Day of Judgment, God will reveal himself, herself, itself to me based on my understanding of God, right? And then I will say, I will affirm God's reality, right? Then God will do something kind of creepy, and because God can do this, right? God will then take a form, because God is reality as such, right? God, no form is ever going to completely exhaust reality as such, right? Even the word reality is not sufficient. It's beyond language, right? Then God will take a form which I do not recognize, right? This is Ibn Arabi's point. And then I will deny God. Then, if I remember correctly, it was a while ago that I read this, but if I'm not mistaken, then God will ask me, and each and every one of us, according to sort of Akbarian metaphysics, do I want to enter heaven based on my good deeds or based on God's mercy? And then we will say, God, based on your mercy. In other words, so the point being, and there's a fascinating study done by Ian Almond where he compares Akbarian metaphysics to his sort of insights about the unique sort of makeup that each and every one of us has. And he was writing how many hundreds of years ago, right? To Derrida, Jacques Derrida, the very, the famous French thinker, the postmodern philosopher. And and this is a major contribution of postmodern thought, which is that every single one of us, by virtue of our our upbringing and unique sort of set of human experiences, we experience reality differently from everyone else. All of which is to say, the reason why I mention this, which I think goes back to one of the points that I was making before we went live, and I can't remember if I mentioned it after we went live as well, which is to say that there isn't a single person, whether we ideologically, in theory agree. In other words, no two Muslims can necessarily, by definition, understand God in the same way. Right? We can agree on certain principles, but our experience is going to be unique, and only I know the reality of that. Only you know the reality of that, Abdullah Gondal. Only you know and Abdullah Samir. Each and every one of us, right? Our experience of reality is unique to ourselves, and what religions do historically have done, they've provided a framework for people to come to certain agreements about broad-based principles. Right, about how society should function, how we engage with one another, how we transcend ourselves. I think that the deepest message that all the traditions provide, whether they agree, and they don't agree in certain in certain formulas. If I can finish this thought, they don't agree in certain formulas. But, and this is Foucault's point, right? The famous French philosopher, who's probably, as far as I can tell, the most important philosopher of the last 50 years, certainly influenced me significantly. He makes the point, he describes what he calls technologies of the self, right? How the self is formed and shaped. And he wasn't a theist by any means. He was very critical, especially of Western Christianity. So religions provide a technology of the self to ultimately transcend itself.
Okay. So do you believe these books are actually from God? Like, so you believe there's some power or force greater than ourselves that actually sent revelation to humanity? You believe that the Quran is... Do you believe the Quran is the word of God? Because you left Islam, obviously. You're a Christian now. You don't call yourself ex-Muslim, but do you believe the Quran is the word of God? Do you believe the Bible is the inspired word of God? What's your view on the scriptures? And then after we talk about that, I'd like to go back to what you said about religion being a sort of manual or technology for how to live or something like that. You were saying
technology of the self, right?
Technology of the self. So yeah, we'll get back to that. But first, I want to know what you think about the scriptures. Do you believe the Quran is the word of God? Like Allah is the creator of the universe that sent revelation to Muhammad that he should marry his adopted son's ex-wife if he wanted to, and thereby forbidding adoption and calling the children by the names of the adopted parents, thereby not allowing them to inherit from the family, from the father, the not considered actual family members. All of this happened after Muhammad wanted to marry Zainab, which Allah confirmed.
Your fundamental question,
the
fundamental question is, do I believe the Quran is the word of
and I'm
God?
giving an example of like how.
Right. And these are details. We can mention countless details, right? You're choosing to understandably because you self-identify.
No, but I'm giving an example that shows that Muhammad.
The key question is, do I think the Quran is the word of God?
Yeah.
I would respond by saying that I believe that there is a transcendent realm, that is beyond the physical. Right, there are multiple levels of reality, and the physical. The physical, the plastic. That's kind of the it's not the lowest form, but what we refer to as the physical is actually just one level of reality, and there are multiple levels of reality, and there's a reality beyond reality even as such, right? There's a completely unfathomable reality from which has, by its very nature, it has, as it were, it has revealed of itself, right? The very fact that we can think, right? The very fact that we can ratiocinate, the very fact that we have intuition, right? The question of intuition, right, is a very interesting one, which is very hard to explain in sort of materialistic terms. People try, but I'm not convinced yet.
So I don't understand where you're going with this. Is the Quran the word of God? Like, that was the question, and I gave you an example of.
Right.
So what was the answer?
It depends. I think it depends on your definition of God. I think it depends on your definition of word.
What's your definition of God?
Right. People have literally spent millennia trying to define God, right? And my understanding of God is that there's a transcendent realm beyond our senses. Right, there's a realm beyond everything that we can even imagine, right? Where thinking itself breaks down, and where we have to enter into a realm of Ibn Arabi called it the hayra, right? A sense of sort of bewilderment. That mystics through the ages have called bewilderment. That's the realm where we can begin to have intimations of what God is.
So was Muhammad having intimations with God when he wanted to marry Zainab, his adopted son's wife, and Allah came down and gave a revelation where, according to the seerah, he just barged into her house and she was shocked and she said, "What are you doing in my house? I don't have my hijab on." He said, "I'm now your husband because Allah married you to me from above the seven heavens without any wali." So Allah was basically doing the nikah straight from heaven. Now, for someone like me who is not a believer in Islam, when you look at the story, you're like, damn, this guy's just making up shit so that he can.
Seems a little. You would perhaps say it's
a red flag. It's a huge red flag.
Convenient, right?
Like, it's like your genie in a lamp. That whenever you need something, you call this genie and you're like, can I have this woman? Yep, you can marry her. And the social implications from this for Sunni Muslims to this day, you have problems. Like, if you want to, like, I know an example of a case, someone in my family who they couldn't have kids. I won't mention who it is. And so they adopted. And what happened was, now the boy they adopted cannot be alone with the mom because they're not mahram to each other. And he's not considered part of the family because he's adopted. So what she had to do, she tried to get milk from her breast, but she wasn't able to get pregnant. So she tried taking some pills and stuff so she could breastfeed the baby. Because if you breastfeed the baby, you become related to the baby in Sunni Islam. So in Sunni Islam, like, for the last 1400 years, the children were adopted have been worse off because Muhammad wanted to marry his adopted son's ex-wife. Now, when I think when we talk about religion in general and intimation with God and spirituality and the divine, and we can get carried away, but when we look at the practical reality on the road, on the street, like religion,
let's
an
talk about
example of
practical
religion
reality.
hurting people.
I mean, if I can just respond to that,
Mhm.
let's talk about practical realities, right? I mean, and I'm not sure it's about getting carried away. Look, I am a scholar by training, right? I have a PhD in philosophy and religion
Mhm.
from one of the best universities in the world, just factually speaking, right? My job is thinking for thought's sake,
Okay.
right? This is what I do. This is what I do for a living, right? It doesn't pay very well, but this is what I do. This is my bread and butter. So we can say it's getting carried away, or we could say we need thinkers. People actually think outside the box like yourselves, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, what are we doing with our time, right? So I'm not convinced it's just getting carried away. It's about, you know, engaging in sort of intelligent thought experiments, trying to make sense, a better sense of reality as such, which can ultimately never be boxed in. This is something I think we can all agree with, that reality as such, whether we come to it from a scientific point of view or a scientistic, some might say, point of view, or what have you, it can never be, no formula is going to do justice to reality as such. And what we have, as far as the practical, and you mentioned examples from the Prophet Sirah, what I will say, so there's a principle in the Bible, right? There's a verse in the Bible which says, by their fruits ye shall know them, right? And I would say that there's an expression in the English language where they say the devil is in the details, right? And these expressions exist for a reason, right? They didn't just come out of nowhere, right? I think there's deep wisdom in that. So we can either get caught up in the details, or we can, and details are important. I'm not trying to say details are not important, but we can't lose sight of the bigger picture either, right? At the same time, we can't lose sight of the details while keeping the bigger picture in mind. And it's a tough one, right? Again, my tendency is to think in bigger picture terms, because this is what I do. Now, if we look at the historic Islamic tradition, talking in practical terms, by their fruits ye shall know them. The historic Islamic intellectual tradition, you know, in those very broad-based terms, has been factually speaking. Sorry?
It's kind of cutting out. Is it? Can you hear everything fine?
Abdullah Samir, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly fine. Yep.
Oh, okay. So Gondal was concerned that I was cutting out. Okay. So the historic Islamic intellectual tradition, right, in broad-based terms, that there isn't a single Islam, right, has produced some of the greatest thinkers the world has ever seen. It has been one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. Some may even argue it is the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. And I don't want to get into a debate about which one is greater or not, but it has certainly produced some of the greatest minds the world has ever seen. And as far as I'm concerned, we can get caught up in the details of you know, the Prophet's life or not, or we can see what has, taking the biblical injunction, by their fruits you shall know them, right? What has the Islamic tradition produced? It's produced some of the greatest philosophers the world has ever seen, literally. People who, Ibn Sina, who was one of the greatest philosophers the world has ever seen, one of the greatest people of medicine, as well, I mean, he, as well as being a musician, as well as being all sorts of things, his medicine was literally taught in Europe a little over 100 years ago. Which, I mean, how, you know, how many centuries? So this is, you know, this is my position, right? What has the historic Islamic tradition produced? It has produced incredible beauty in the world. You see, and I say this as someone who is Christian as well, right? So, you know, just as Christianity has produced some of the greatest works of literature, the greatest works of art and music and so on and so forth, and it has some sides that are problematic, especially Western Christianity. So, right? It has a lot of issues, right?
Okay,
but
so
I'm also Eastern Orthodox, so
I just feel like we're losing a lot of objectivity in our talk, right? Like right now we're talking about religion in the world, right? And I mean, that's just subjective because the certain religions bring certain good to the world, certain religions brought certain goods to the world. Like, there's no denying that. But what I'm trying to get to is you can't judge a religion's truth claim or its veracity based on maybe how many philosophers or how many people followed it. That's argument ad populum, right? Secondly, there's a huge portion where you were mentioning the uniqueness of human subjectivity as being very important, right? Like your own subjective human experience. Now, I'm a student of neuroscience, and going from that perspective itself, like from, as you said, view it from a broader sense, right? When you view the idea of a self being an illusion, it's very well understood in the neuroscience community. Like, babies aren't born with the idea of a self; they develop the self up to the age of 2 years, and it's not even exclusive to humans, right? Like, chimps have displayed enormous, very intelligent behavior. They have an idea of a self. Magpies, dolphins, elephants do as well, right? So using our, and from a neurological perspective, you see these patterns in human behavior over and over and over again. Now, the problem is, and I recognize this, many neuroscientists do, is that back in the day, people did not have the tools to understand what we're understanding right now. I would say the Buddhist tradition got really close to it and did understand that the self being an illusion, and there's a lot of benefit in that tradition per se. But using our uniqueness to derive truths about objective reality isn't the best way to go about things. Like, for example, you can even say, what is happiness, right? You can say, like, happiness is like release of a certain chemical in the brain, right?
So what, in your estimation, if I may ask, I mean, well, already predicting the answer, but if I could ask you to spell it out, what, in your estimation, would be the best way to go about? So to recap, I'm saying that religions, historically, religions in the plural, right? Whether the great, the so-called great religions and the minor religions, I mean, all the major religions that we know of and the smaller ones, they have all provided, historically and up until today, practicable means for people to live out their lives, right? So in the absence of religion, if we take religion out of the equation, right, in the plural religions as such, then how do we make sense of reality? You would say science?
Exactly. Well, the thing is, we can't limit ourselves to science, okay? Like, you can't go into scientism. At the same time, we can't take our subject.
How do you define scientism? And that's an important word, right?
Okay, so for example, scientism I define as somebody saying that any truth that science says it's true is the absolute and only way to think about it, And they kind of make absolute claim that science about like certain hypotheses or theories, which shouldn't be the case. I mean, there's obviously certain facts that don't change, certain theories that evolve, and hypotheses that can be falsified, right? So a lot of people lose that objectivity and that nuance in understanding science or the methodology of science itself. But what I'm trying to say is that science does give us, so far, the best measure or gauge of what could be objective and what is subjective.
Right. So so my sort of, I think my addendum to that, what you just said, would be that the question of objectivity itself is a big problem, right? There's a big question mark around the very notion of objectivity, right? We know now, and this is why postmodern theorists are so important, and beyond postmodern theory itself, but even this as well as I do, right? That the very act of observing a system changes the system, right? So what is objectivity? It's an idea, right? Ultimately, if I were to say to you, I'm going to keep referring to this because it's right here, but right, to use this Ganesh, statue, just as a physical object, objectively speaking, what is this, right? And we may have certain analyses in terms of the material that's used, in terms of its constitution, its shape, its measurements, colors, etc., 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 right? Now, that's a lens that we can bring to it, right? That's certainly not an unimportant lens. And many modern subjects that we would say, well, this is the lens to bring to it because this is the lens that we can all agree on, right? And this has been sort of the truth claim of science for some time now, modern science. And we can say, well, that objective lens does not exhaust the reality of this symbol, which is it's a symbol, right? For believers, for people who refer to Lord Ganesh as Lord Ganesh, who pray to him. You know, this is something that is pervaded with a type of energy, and it responds to our prayers. And you know, and scientists might say, people like yourselves might say, well, what a load of hogwash. Like, how do you even measure that? How do you even confirm that? My point being that...
But there was an attempt, right, to measure that. Like the Harvard prayer study is one example.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's
Right.
one way to show that prayer has no actual effect.
Well, I think this is the where we sort of will start to run up against necessarily we'll start to run up against certain walls. That if we give science, if we put science, modern science, in its place, that it is a means for measuring things in the world, right? For providing us certain barometers of things, facts on the ground. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. Obviously, it's because of science that we're even talking today, right? Modern science and technology, right? Like, I would not literally know of you guys' existence today if it were not for, you know, the benefits of modern science. At the same time, to say that modern science, as many people are doing, Sam Harris, for instance, being one of the major proponents of this right now, right? That through facts we can come to we can derive morality from facts. We can derive the why of things from the how of things, right? Or I'm not convinced, right?
I agree with you there.
I would agree too.
It's not convincing, right? We can't go shift from modern science's understanding of how things work in a sort of somewhat of a mechanistic sense, right? We can't. You see my point? We can't get beyond, like, okay, great, but then what, right? What do we have beyond that? And I think this is where, you know, and I think that the definition of religion itself needs to be broadened, right? Religion is not just the main traditions that we know of: Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., 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 shamanism. Religion is what we do as human beings, right? I mean, the famous scholar of religion, right, who in many ways actually created religious studies, who certainly was a major force behind creating religious studies in the American context, Mircea Eliade, he described the human experience as such, as by the phrase homo religiosus, right? That we are religious beings by nature. So whether we adhere to a organized tradition or not, we're going to manifest certain sort of religiously, consciously and unconsciously, sort of, right? So
that's what I was bringing back to. Like, we have these patterns in human behavior that we manifest. Like, for example, look at every culture or region of the earth. Like, they have some form of religiosity or spirituality in their tradition, even though it might be conflicting, but it's present, you know. So we want to, like, we're driven by this curiosity.
And people of science as well. I mean, I would contend that's the whole point. Hence the idea of scientism, right?
Yeah.
When we turn science into a religion unconsciously, right? Like, we have, as people of science, we have certain doctrines, like, you know, the prophet of scientism one of them certainly would be Darwin, right? Another would be Copernicus, and so forth, right?
I don't know if I would agree though, because we don't take the words as dogma. If someone else comes along and says, well, Darwin was completely wrong, I'd be like, okay, let's see what you have and why it's better. And, you know,
sure.
I mean, it would be shocking because, you know, 150 years have proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that evolution by natural selection is one of the most, you know, like, accurate and fair representations of how nature actually works. So it would be surprising, but it's not a prophet by that means, unless of course you have like dogmatic, like, I don't know, scientism.
Well, you guys you're clearly very reasonable. I mean, this is why I'm talking to you guys. We're having a reasonable discussion about things because you're open-minded and you're not dogmatic. I mean, if there's one thing I strive to be genuinely, is I want to be and we're all biased. We all have our biases just by virtue of being human. But I want to be as little dogmatic as possible and take some work. At the same time, right, I think people, not yourselves, but it's very often that people will be sort of rabid, foaming at the mouth.
Yeah.
They'll say, well, Darwin said this and it's evil. Let's take the theory of evolution, right? And so this is a description and an explanation of how life evolves and comes about. But then what, right? This is where traditionally the religions come in. This is where art comes in, right? Like, why is it that we as human beings, we're always creating art, right? Always, regardless of our sort of self-identified religious leanings. We need music, we need art, because we're trying to reach something that is beyond the material, the simplest base, as far as I'm concerned. It is like very low-level stuff, right? The really interesting stuff comes when we start to think beyond this level, right?
So, for example, I'm a neutral person, right? I see religion as a claim about reality, okay? Mm-hmm. And in the same sense, I see science making claims about reality, right? Right. So, for example, just to give you a statistic, there's about 4,000 religions so far in the world and millions of gods. They're all claims about reality. For example, Jesus being born by a virgin is a claim about biology, right? Parthenogenesis. Or, for example...
I wouldn't say it's a claim about biology. It's a claim about...
how the world or universe is...
Well, it's a metaphysical claim, right? It's beyond biology. It's a claim about how we see ourselves in relation to... I mean, that's a topic unto itself.
I'm not separating reality into natural and metaphysical at this point. What I'm trying to say is that every religion is a claim about how reality is to be, right? So when I view
how we relate to that reality, right?
Yeah. So when So when I view these different claims from these thousands of religions, how do I discern which claim about reality is actually accurate? Now, there's
an important question. Yeah.
Again, I'm not an evidentialist, but I do value evidence, but that's not the only thing. I'm not an empiricist. Okay. I definitely agree that using evidence as a basis is a very, very good idea, but we shouldn't limit ourselves to it. There's obviously rational, logical arguments, laws of logic we can use to discern very good things about reality. Now, I just need to know how, for example, we can discern that, okay, Muhammad sitting in a cave spoke to the same angel or the same Holy Spirit that came to Jesus, or, for example, the guy who started Mormonism, right? How do I discern any of these? And then also I'm coming from a perspective of neuroscience. For example, like temporal epilepsy. I've studied this. I wrote a whole long paper about this, like how Muhammad seems to display signs of that too.
Sure.
Now, when you put everything together, I'm, as a neutral person, I'm reading the Bible and I read the Quran and I read these books. They're all contradicting each other. They're all making mutually exclusive on the face of it.
So how do we sift through it?
Well, how do we understand what's the truth?
This is a very important question. And I want to sort of re-emphasize a point that I've already made a couple of times, but I think it's worth re-mentioning, because you described yourself as a neutral person. I'm not convinced that anyone is neutral. I mean, to be human means we take a position. Which is not a value judgment. It's just, I'm not neutral, you're not neutral, no one's neutral. We have perspectives and we have, certain opennesses, right? Some of us are more open than not. And clearly you strike me as someone, you're both seeking we're all seeking to understand more fully, right? So that being said, as far as the mutual contradictions, on the one hand, we've touched upon that already a little bit. As far as which one do we decide is the right one for me? Well, what the Sufi will say, right? The Islamic mystic, he or she will say, just as the Christian mystic will say, just as the yogi will say, just as the Buddhist will say, if you want to experience the realities that our that we are describing, that our literature is describing, that our metaphysics is describing, then one needs to enter into a period of training. Just as you're training to be a neuroscientist, right? Just as, one can't just pick up a book of quantum mechanics one day and decide, I'm going to, there's some rigorous training that's involved, right? Similarly, in these sort of spiritual, intellectual traditions, there's a rigorous both intellectual, spiritual, and physiological training. If one undergoes that, then one can begin to see the reality of it or not. And I certainly can speak from personal experience for what it's worth. Having practiced Eastern Christianity, having practiced Buddhist practices, quite seriously, not some weekend thing, quite seriously. Buddhism a lot less than Christianity. Christianity much less than Islam. Having practiced some of the Hindu practices, yoga and so forth, I can speak to the veracity of these truth claims. Now you can accept it or not. Now it's like this, right? That there is a type of, look, put it this way, Imam al-Ghazali, right, one of the great Sufi theoreticians in the Islamic tradition, he says, he uses this really powerful homely metaphor. He says, how can you describe with language what sex feels like to someone who has never experienced sex? You can't. No matter how much we try, until you have sex, there's no amount of language that's going to describe it, right? In a similar fashion, similarly, and I think that there's some very interesting research that has already been done in the 70s and continues to be done, is in the realm of psychedelics, right? How do you experience it? How do you describe what it's like to take, whether LSD, whether to take mushrooms, magic mushrooms, and so forth? No amount of language is going to. I don't know if you guys have. I have, right? It's an extremely mind expanding, reality, reconfiguring, awakening experience, which one has to go through before, I can talk about these things till I go blue in the face, right? Until you try it, you're not going to know it, right? My recommendation to you vis-a-vis some of these traditions is, if we're serious about it, right? And you guys strike me as people who are serious, right? About these things, give it a try, right? And it's not going to happen overnight. And try it because, for the sake of your own expansion, right? Check out Buddhism. Buddhism is an extremely rich tradition.
So
Nothing that the neuroscientists have arrived at today, nothing that the psychologists have arrived at today, has added an iota to what the Buddhists already figured out centuries ago. I guarantee you.
I would disagree with that. I would definitely. As a student of neuroscience,
Sure.
The thing that what you're coming back to, you mentioned the bewilderment of Ibn Arabi, and a lot of these people, what they were experiencing and what we understand in neuroscience community is a loss of self, okay, which literally is a loss of subject-object perception,
right,
and you feel like oneness with reality, okay?
Which all the mystical traditions talk about.
Yeah. Now the problem is, put yourself in shoes of people 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. They had absolutely no idea how the brain was really working. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
not the way that we did. They had a different understanding, right, of the human being as such.
When you compare the understanding we have now, and we can make certain objective claims about how the brain works now, that people living in those times were completely oblivious to. Okay.
True. Yes and no. I'm not convinced. Sorry to interrupt, but I think this is an important point. So again, I'm a student of philosophy. I'm a student of history, and we have to, and certainly a student of Foucault, and to take a Foucauldian sort of approach to things, we have to, and this is much easier said than done, right? We have to somehow step outside of ourselves to question why it is that we have, even formulate the questions that we do, the thoughts that we do, right? So from a Foucauldian point of view, Foucault would argue very convincingly, many have felt, I certainly feel, that the idea, the narrative of progress we have, which is what you're echoing necessarily. So the idea that the knowledge that we have today as modern sciences unveiling for us is necessarily better than what they had hundreds of years ago. I'm not convinced by that narrative. They had different, and this is a narrative that comes out of the Enlightenment. It comes out of the notion of progress, right? That we are constantly necessarily progressing and improving. I mention all of this just by way of addendum, if you allow me, because, for instance, I mean, from a Cartesian point of view, from a post-Descartes, René Descartes, historically speaking, philosophical point of view, you know, we are sort of basically housed in our heads, right? I think, therefore I am, right? The famous dictum, cogito ergo sum. And now we're beginning to realize, and postmodern theorists, again, have been pointing this out for a very long time, and increasingly modern science is catching up to this. Believe it or not, it's actually quite slow as far as catching up to this. They're beginning to realize and note that the human being is not housed in the head. I'm sure you know this, right? Pointed out Abdullah Gondal, right? They're referring to the gut as the second brain. There's really cutting edge research right now being, I mean, it's at the most cutting edge of this type of stuff, that there's there's a bidirectional relationship between the gut.
So can I ask something once you're done? Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So you just made a very good point about the second brain in the gut. I thought about something that one of my friends once mentioned to me, which is that whenever we look at all of these ancient books, we never find any external confirmation of a greater being speaking to humanity. We never find any new information. For example, in the Quran, not once do we see any mention of a female egg. It always talks about the male fluid and the female fluid mixing from a fluid ejected from the back, you know, the typical argument between backbone and the ribs, which is, you know, beaten to death by Islamic apologists and anti-Islamic apologists, whatever. So we don't find the Quran ever, any religious book, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, any of them, mention that about bacteria, about, you know, even the female egg is a good example. And the reason I like that example is because, you know, a kind of modern dawa move is to say the Quran mentions, you know, some of the scientific things. But I would expect that if the book is truly from God, it should contain something external, some external confirmation that it's coming from, that it's not coming from the brain of the one that's bringing it to you, but it has some external, you know what I'm saying? So that's one thing. I'm kind of curious. How do you kind of reconcile that? Like the Quran or the Bible never mentions the brain as the center of thinking. They used to believe it was a liver.
Right. Well, right. So and the heart also in sort of traditional metaphysics plays a massive role, and or you know, in Christianity as well. So it's Abdullah Gondal, before I interrupted you, you were going somewhere as well. I'm sorry I interrupted you. So not to sort of not to avoid Abdullah Samir's question, but I didn't want to take away from your thought because I interrupted you.
Yeah, I was just going forth with the idea that we now understand like how the brain generates the illusion of the self, right? But to a person 1,000, 10,000 years back, the loss of self or the experience, the dropout of subject-object perception seems divine. Only now can we understand fully what's going on and to be sure that, okay, this is not something supernatural happening. And for example, let's just say that the claim that there's a soul, right? Like when you put it to a basic test, like the way the brain's compartmentalized, like if you damage a certain part of the brain, you lose the ability to perceive faces. You damage another, you lose language, your memory is affected and whatnot. Now, is the soul being affected at that time, or is this the person's conscious ability to perceive? Is the soul intact while the person's brain is damaged? You know, so there's a lot of questions and neuroscience comes into stark conflict with the idea of a soul. So eventually, if you damage the brain enough, the person dies. But then religion tells us that no, after you damage it enough, the soul will detach with all its faculties intact perfectly. So these are things that don't make sense, especially when you consider the idea of the self being an illusion, us not being born with it, rather evolving into it, and then us not even being the only agents that have the idea of a self. You come to the stark realization that the soul, or our whole idea of like how we address things, like, hey, I'm lucky, for example, when you say I'm lucky to be born in Canada. When we say that, we don't realize that we have a hidden assertion here, that we are asserting that we somehow existed prior to our birth and that us being born into a certain place is somehow lucky.
Right.
Or like, so the whole idea is like we are valuing our subjective idea of the self too much here. And we bend a lot on using that as an argument for religion or its veracity.
I think you're right. I can't disagree with that. There's certainly absolutely an over validation, valuation of the self. Absolutely, and I think all the great traditions speak to this, right? In the Islamic Sufism is all about that, right? That the self, the image. Iqbal writes about this. I mean, Iqbal, is of course learning from the great Sufis before him, that the image of the drop returning to the sea. Well, Iqbal critiques that anyway. That's another discussion. But historically, all the mystics have sort of pointed to the ocean, right? So we are at best waves on this ocean, which is ultimately unfathomable. And this is the tension, right? This is really a tension because on the one...
How is it unfathomable? I didn't understand.
The ocean, I mean, metaphorically speaking, right? I mean, what does it know? What does it mean to know the self, right? That this ancient doctrine, that the idea of know thyself, and the Islamic tradition picks this up, all the other traditions pick this up, that to know oneself is to know ultimate reality itself. The self, the human self, is ultimately, it's endless. It's endlessly meaningful and revealing. That's really what I'm getting to. But in any case, to back to Abdullah Gondal's point, absolutely, I agree with you 100%. We overemphasize the self, right? We say, this is a me culture. We're living in the age of
individualism
culture, right? Individualism, right? And if anything, really, I mean, if anything, not only, I mean, I don't want to say that religion has all the answers, end of the story. I'm not convinced by that. But certainly, historically, it has provided a very valuable means for us to question this overemphasis on the self. And functionally speaking, and this is where the tension lies, right? Functionally speaking, if I don't think that myself has a reality in and of itself, then I'm going to stop taking care of myself. I'm going to stop eating. And there have been many, historically speaking, mystics who really denied the body and they withered away. They didn't die as a result. But the point being, there's a funny tension on the one hand between valuing myself enough to the point where I think that I give myself its due, and at the same time recognizing that I am inseparable from everything else. And this is why I love Buddhism so much, right? Buddhism has this profound notion of but
it didn't sound to me that that's what he was saying. It sounded to me that he was saying there's no such thing as a soul, that the idea of the self is basically created by our brains, by the default mode, which we now know is a default mode network. And when you take psychedelics, it actually tears away the default mode network to the point that you no longer feel that you're a separate entity from the rest of the world. You become connected with the rest of the world. And Michael Pollan, in his book on, or How to Open Your Mind, he talks about how this wouldn't have been evolutionarily beneficial if we all walked around like, oh, me and the tree are one. Right. I am the tree, and instead we wouldn't even want. And I watched a video that one of my good friends, Philip Philip sent me about people on LSD, and the guy, he didn't want to eat food. Like he was like, I'm in so much joy right now.
Well, this is the mystical experience.
But the point is that we now have a scientific explanation for this, that it's a default mode network, that's a certain part of the brain that's being when you turn it off, you have either by meditation or by drugs.
But I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that the scientific explanation explains it away.
But there's no reason to even posit a soul in the first place. Why do we even theorize that there is a soul, there's such a thing as a soul? Because everything about a personality is like, for example, like Gondal was saying, like, for example, when like the guy that had a pole goes through his brain and his personality changed completely. Or for example, someone that goes into a coma or has a seizure and the personality changes, or someone that has Alzheimer's and doesn't remember their children. There's nothing about ourselves that's not connected to our brain. To me, as a materialist, it seems like a one-to-one connection between the brain and our personalities. They're like, one-to-one. So once the brain is gone, I stop existing. Like, so
again, to my earlier point, we're not housed in the brain. And the latest cutting-edge research is showing that we're not housed in the brain. We are the sum total. The sum total not only of the whole body, right, the physical thing, but even external, influences, right, in a very profound way, in ways that we're only beginning, we as modern sort of subjects are only I'm convinced that Buddhists, for example, have a very profound understanding of this, the idea of it's not codependent arising, it's something arising, that everything in existence for this flower for these flowers to come into existence, to be here right now, they require everything else in the cosmos, which is some mind, it's a trippy, but ultimately I exist by virtue of not only my parents, not only by virtue of all the food I've eaten, right, or not only by virtue of my education, that we are depend on each and every one of us is dependent on everything else around us for our very existence,
except God.
Except God, in that archetypal definitional sense. True. No, this is true. This is fair, and we can take it or leave it. But as far as the soul is concerned, whether it's necessary to theorize the soul or not, we live as though the soul exists, right? Mm-hmm. For better and for worse. We live, whether we self-identify as religious, as theistic or not, we live as though the soul, you, Abdullah Samir, live as though there is such a thing, such a person, such an entity as Abdullah Samir. Same for you.
The self-identification is different than a soul, right? Like, do you know what I mean? It's a mental conception.
I think they're intimately connected, right? And this is Jordan Peterson's point, right? I don't know what your take on Jordan Peterson. I personally have learned a lot from him, and I think he has massive gaps. So on the topic of whether he believes, God exists or not, Sam Harris poses this question to him, and Jordan Peterson responds by saying that Sam Harris himself lives as though God is real, right? Like, however we conceptualize God, there is a reality beyond ourselves, right? That we cannot ultimately reduce to simple formulas, right? We all live as though there is a reality that transcends us.
The thing is, what's happening right now is you're using our yearning for a meaning or a purpose in life.
Yes.
And that subjective need that's in us, and then it's almost being imposed and taken as something objective. So what I'm trying to get to is, like, I'll give you this thought, okay? For example,
can I just suggest something? I don't mean to interrupt, but the words subjective and objective are they have certain assumptions about them. Could we try using different words? Again, as someone who's steeped in postmodern theory, I'm very aware of what the implicit meanings, the sort of power implications that words have. Can we try some words that are not subjective and objective? Let's try different
words. For example, our human subjective experience, let's just put it as that, right? We think that it's
so your human individual experience, right?
Yeah, like the way, So for example, like, we can think, we can perceive, we can reason and logic in our heads, and we think that we are so superior, right? And therefore we think we're different and that we have a soul like animals
We're
don't.
superior to other animals.
Sorry?
We think we're superior to other animals.
Exactly.
Very often, right? And we think we're superior to other people, right? I mean, this is a human problem.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, what we see in religion is it says that when humans die, or there will be an afterlife for humans, like humans will have judgment, good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell.
Right.
So when we look at neuroscience, and especially like when we look at chimpanzees, they have an astonishing amount of intelligence. Like they'll beat us in short-term memory tests by a long shot, right? Chimps can beat 4 to 5 year old kids in puzzle solving. If you look at kanji, can learn thousands of words with it in language, and it also started using logic. For example, this one time, there's this researcher saw on video, asked her to put water on this banana, or I think it was a strawberry. Instead of pouring it from the jug in front of him, he went outside and put it outside. Okay, then the researcher is like, what are you doing? And then the monkey pointed outside and said that it's raining outside, so there's water still going on it.
No way.
Yeah. So now what I'm trying to get to is, when
yes, human cognition is deep. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. So now, do we limit the soul only to humans, or do chimps also have a soul? Do they have like a heaven or a hell?
This is a very important question.
Exactly, right? So why does religion limit this idea of like judgment of heaven and hell only exclusively to humans, when now we know that we are not the only agents with conscious perception?
I don't think religion as such does that, right? Certain religions have done that historically. Buddhism certainly doesn't. Hinduism certainly doesn't. Many of these, more shamanic traditions certainly don't, right? There's a very sort of sophisticated understanding of intelligence pervading all of existence. Sufism, Islamic mysticism, very profoundly understands and appreciates that, based not least of all on the Quranic verse itself, where God, from a Muslim point of view, says about animals, right, having communities like yourselves, like us, right? And an interesting factoid, which blew me away when I first heard this from one of my great teachers, Sayyid Hussein Nasr. He pointed out that the very first animal hospitals to be created historically were done by Muslims, which and to look at Muslims today, who are so, unfortunately, they're complex, economic, political reasons as to why this is the case, a profound disrespect of the natural world, which, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can tell, is not a Quranic view of the natural world. A deep appreciation of, intelligence and beauty, and all of creation being this sort of complex symphony, praising, right, the creator from the traditional Islamic metaphysical point of view. So I don't disagree with that. And I think this is where some of the metaphysics has to be not reinterpreted, but there's certain thinkers that have to be brought to the forefront, and people have to be an issue that I've had. So I just want to make this point very quickly, up, listener. An issue that I've had for a very long time, and this will not be, popular with many, Muslims perhaps, and whatever. I mean, the point is, reading many of these historic Islamic intellectual figures. An issue that I had before my conversion experience in 2016 to Christianity was that I read these people, whether people like Ibn Arabi, whether people like Ibn Sina, Rumi, Ghazali, and so on and so forth. I read their understanding of reality and the human animal's relationship to the rest of the cosmos and so forth. Extremely sophisticated, extremely rich, poetic, beautiful. And they self-identified as Muslim. And I would see and do see a lot of the discourses that are being conducted by self-identified Muslims today, not very often self-identified, Muslim intellectuals, let alone, people who are not sort of necessarily intellectually engaged. And the disparity is huge. And I thought to myself, they were Muslim and these are Muslims. Are these the same species? Like literally, I've had this thought historically. The historic Islam, all of which is to say, to make the point that the historic Islamic intellectual tradition is extremely rich. And Muslims, who care about it, they owe it to themselves to rediscover the historic Islamic intellectual tradition.
So I think what Abdullah Gondal was saying, he made a very good point that we put ourselves, that much of religion is just kind of elevating the human being. It's a very infantile.
I'm not convinced it is. I do not. I responded to that point. I'm not convinced, but I do not agree with that categorization.
Well, okay. So I don't mean like I do know. I mean, I know he said religion, but if you speak about basically Islam and Christianity, and maybe even Judaism, you've taken the human being as basically an evolved chimp, and you've put them on the class of a higher being, and you're saying now that they have a soul. And then you're saying there's heaven and hell, and you'll be with your family, and do you believe that there's such a thing as heaven and hell? Just as a question, just curiosity.
I certainly believe in human suffering and human happiness, and
on this earth, of course. But like, is there any next life to come? Do you think?
I mean, how do you define heaven? How do you define hell? I mean,
it's some other reality after you die. Like, do you believe in the resurrection after death?
I mean. These are such. I'm sorry. These are loaded questions, right? I mean,
they're pretty straightforward in the text. I mean, there's a heaven, there's a hell. You'll be resurrected. Like the seerah is full of the people challenging Muhammad and saying that we don't believe that these bones are going to come back to life. And even there's a story of one of the kuffar like stepping on the bone and mocking Muhammad and saying, "You're saying that bone I just stepped on is going to come back and resurrected." And it's going to be, recreated in front of God, and it's going to be answering.
So I would like to respond to this question and some of the things that have gone before by this something of an oblique, somewhat obliquely, but not. You'll see where I'm going with this. I think it's part of the human condition. In response to your earlier question about what's the soul, what are we doing with this sort of old idea, right? What's the point, right? And the idea of the soul necessitates this idea of, eternal life and things like that, right? If we don't have a concept of the soul, then it doesn't make sense to talk about eternal life. This ties in with the question of heaven and hell, and so forth. Again, I'm a student of religion and religion and philosophy, right? And religion as such, I think is very, as a conceptual category, needs to be opened up. Why do I say this now? Going back to the question of our being religious by nature, right? There's a fascinating movement right now, which is I'm quite obsessed about, and I've thought a lot about, and I've been thinking a lot about for a few years now, called transhumanism, right? These are you guys familiar with transhumanism and transhumanism?
Just mention it again, just so everybody knows what it is. Yeah.
So transhumanists, basically, they're very often, typically, not always, there's Christian transhumanists, there's Buddhist transhumanists, I'm sure there's some Muslim transhumanists there, but typically they self-identify as atheist, right? They believe they're very, some major transhumanists in Silicon Valley today. Ray Kurzweil is a major transhumanist, very, very influential, right? Is playing a major role in Google. So these are not stupid people, in other words, right? They don't believe in religion traditionally understood. At the same time, they believe they can attain immortality through technology, right? Now, so the reason why I mention this by way of, sort of an oblique, an oblique way to respond to your questions, is to say that the human being is a strange creature, as far as we know, right? We don't know yet vis-a-vis other creatures, other animals. But amongst all the animals, it seems to be the case that we have this odd, a tendency to imagine ourselves living forever, whether we have a theistic view of the world or not. This is a fascinating phenomenon, just as an academic to think about, that why is it that even if we don't believe in religion traditionally understood, if we believe in technology and science, and we are creating our own realities, right? This idea of, bettering ourselves through CRISPR technologies, gene editing technologies, right? Which was recently a big topic in China, and is only going to continue to be a bigger topic, right? With one of these scientists supposedly creating twins who won't get AIDS, right? They're immune to AIDS. Now, anyway, you see my point, right?
But isn't that more like an atheist heaven, like believing in science to create immortality? What does that have to do with religion?
Well, there you go, right? Well, this is my point again. So I keep harping on about this point. It has this to do with religion insofar, again, as we have a tendency to think in religious terms, right?
Okay.
The very fact that you said, and Abdullah Samir, you just said, right, isn't this the atheist heaven, right? Like it's a heaven on earth. But I mean, just factually speaking, beyond the confines of this debate/discussion, it's a fascinating thing to ponder. Like, why do we do this, right? There's something going on, right, which is not immediately explicable. Certainly not in scientific terms yet, right?
Right. What's not explicable?
One could ask, did our need to survive and live on give rise to the idea of the soul, or the idea of soul existing in religion give rise to our need to survive? It could be seen as circular, right?
It's a great question. I certainly don't have I mean, what's your intuition, Abdullah Gondal?
I mean, I honestly, when you come to the meaning of life, and the way I look at it is talking about a cosmic, broader perspective. Is I see reality being very weird, and then when we look at the cosmos, there's black holes existing, we don't know why. Most of things we can't explain why they exist, right?
Right. Yeah.
And but when we realize that most of reality has no meaning to it, or at least to us appears to have no meaning. There's thousands, billions of planets floating for no reason. What's going on? Why are the stars exploding?
Right.
Exactly. So, but when you come to realization that meaning, or the existence of meaning, might not be an objective thing in itself. Our need for meaning to exist, or our need for survival, does not mean that meaning actually, or a purpose in life actually exists.
Okay.
So that's what I'm trying to go with it, right? And we also
that's not an unfair categorization, right? I mean, I think so. I think it can be said, right, that whether meaning exists outside of ourselves, we don't know. We factually we can know something. Yeah. But what we do know, and this we cannot deny, right, that we are meaning-making machines, right, to use that word construction. We consistently create meaning, right?
Yeah.
The famous what is his name now? His name's on top of the tip of my tongue. Man's Search for Meaning, right?
Oh, Victor Stengel or something?
Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, right? So an Auschwitz survivor. He was a psychiatrist. He survived and subsequently wrote Man's Search for Meaning. Tony Robbins always refers to it, and many people refer to it. He realized that people who in Auschwitz, where apparently, I mean, this is unthinkable. It's literally unthinkable for us, and God forbid that we ever have to even experience. Anyone has to experience that kind of reality. Nevertheless, it was a reality that he experienced, and he saw many people experiencing it. The prisoners in these camps who managed to create a meaning for themselves actually lived, and those who lost all hope and meaning died. And Frankl's point is that human beings, when we imbue our lives consciously and actively with greater meaning, with deeper meanings, then our life necessarily becomes more meaningful, and we have a purpose in life, and we all have meaning. And where that meaning comes from, that's perhaps that's the point of this discussion, but certainly part of the discussion, right? But we cannot get away from the fact that we're always creating meaning, and we make sense of the world through stories, right? We're always creating stories, right? That's how we make sense of the world. And religion has historically been one of the modes for us to make sense of this. Otherwise, apparently, from a sort of evolutionary psychological point of view,
bizarre universe.
I mean, crazy place, right? I mean, I don't necessarily take that characterization wholly to heart, but if we take that position, like, what the hell are we doing here, right? What on earth is the point?
What I see interesting is like how religion came about. Like if you've heard of Dr. Ernest Becker, he's a famous anthropologist. You've heard the name, yeah. So he wrote very beautifully about it. It's like our intelligence evolved, or our foresight and ability to think evolved because it helps us survive. It's an evolutionary aspect, right? But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword. Like, imagine like you realizing that, oh, at the end of like 60, 70 years old, I'm just gonna be in the ground being worm food, right?
Right.
And then when you look at reality as a general, like there's so much suffering. For example, there's so much negativity in the universe. For example, people dying, loved ones dying. There's earthquake, blah, blah, blah. There could be a star exploding, and one gamma ray burst could kill us. There's already been 5 mass extinction events, right? Now, in that bleak and depressing reality...
We've already entered the 6th mass extinction, right? We're already...
Exactly. It's global. Right. It could happen anytime. Yeah. Like, Apophis could hit 10 years down the road.
No. I mean, according to many scientists, we're already in it.
It's
happening as we speak. But
exactly. Right. So... when our ancestors open their eyes, or when they start thinking about this, like when you realize and you look at reality brutally what it is depressing. It's hard. It could lead to depressive or existential crisis.
It's painful. Right? It's
so that's right. So that's where I see that our ancestors created religion as a way to comfort or somehow make sense of all the bizarreness that's going on around them. Now, because they were living in their own pockets and in times of history where, let's just say, they weren't as knowledgeable about objective reality or oblivious. Like what I say is like our universe begins where our ancestors' universe ends.
Can you rephrase the phrase objective reality? just because they're only
our ancestors had no clue what causes diseases. They thought like God sending it, or like what
clouds,
or rain, or thunder, like, or Zeus throwing thunderbolts. Like, you constantly see a pattern. Like, their claims were obviously always supernatural claims have always been replaced by more naturalistic explanations. The more our knowledge increases, right?
Sure.
So I see religion as this same thing. Initially, it started just as humans trying to make sense of reality, and they're sincere. Their intentions were sincere, I'm saying. And over time, you see religions evolve as well. Like you go from like many gods, from worshiping stones to like, philosophy evolves, humans get more knowledge, to God becoming, let's say, up in the heaven, and a knowledge grows, God goes outside of reality, and so on and so forth. So when I see the progress in religion, and then over time, humanity coming to the scientific method, and then to me, it seems like it's just a continuous effort of humans trying to understand reality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every historical group's understanding of reality is per se true in all of his truth claims about reality.
Sure. No, I think that's not given the sort of the assumptions that you're going off of. That's a fair criticism. Now,
and I fully endorse the value religion brought to our lives, and I mean it does help with existential issues with a lot of people. Like I know people personally in my life that do find atheism depressing. It's just hard for them to imagine that they'll be dust and bone after they die, right?
Well, Nietzsche. I mean, I don't know if you read Nietzsche, but Nietzsche, who's a phenomenal thinker and has played not an insignificant role in my own intellectual formation. In his brilliant work, The Genealogy of Morals, he sort of concludes right towards the end of The Genealogy of Morals. He says that this sort of taken to its logical conclusion, a world where we no longer believe has any meaning, right? The logical conclusion of that is suicidal nihilism. So I would contend taking a Nietzschean point of view, well, sort of taking a page out of Nietzsche's book there, and also sort of benefiting from Jordan Peterson on this issue, that I would contend, in fact, that we live as though there is meaning. We do, whether we're atheist or not. We, on a daily basis, consciously and more often than not unconsciously, are living as though, because taken to its end, taken to its logical conclusion, if there is no meaning, what the hell are we doing? Like, what the fuck are we doing? I'm sorry, excuse my, they say, I have a French friend, I said, excuse my French, she was like, yeah, in France we say, excuse my English. So excuse my English, but really, no, seriously, what the hell are we doing? Right?
Yeah.
So I'm not convinced that we necessarily, each and every one of us, myself included, right, first and foremost, that we necessarily live according to that which we profess to say we live according to.
Like, I fully understand, like, and I've experienced the loss of self and subject-object perception. I'm into meditation. Even though I experienced it, my everyday life, I still live with the illusion of me as a person existing in this head.
And illusions are necessary. I think these, whether these illusions are wrong in and of themselves, I'm not convinced they're wrong, right? Because that's a value judgment, right? What I'm interested in, for what it's worth, is that, and this is something that, I think a lot about, that, the stories that we have, right, the narratives based on which we live our lives, whatever they may be, religious or otherwise, and what have you, right, are they cultivating us in a way that is beneficial, first and foremost, for ourselves and to society at large, right? Are we cultivating ourselves by virtue of these narratives, or are we not cultivating ourselves, right? And to take again the Foucauldian approach. So Foucault's point is, again, something I mentioned earlier, and this is a very, very important point as far as I can, certainly I'm concerned, that these technologies of the self, right? So the Islamic intellectual tradition is a, historically speaking, do we just lose Abdullah Gondal, or?
No, I'm still here. My video.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the Islamic historic Islamic intellectual tradition, the historic Christian intellectual tradition, and Buddhism, and what have you, atheism, right? New atheism, right, which is a relatively new phenomenon. Like these are ways of making sense of the world, right? And they have within them, built into them, technologies of the self, right? Consciously or unconsciously, they are shaping who we are on a day-to-day basis. Our subjectivity, how we view ourselves, how we interact with the rest of the world, how we interact with other animals, right? How we, etc. Now, the question is, are these technologies of the self allowing us to live more fully as human beings, or are they diminishing us? So and that's an open question. That's an open question, but it's a very important question.
So I'd like to tackle that. So what I wanted to kind of jump into is why, myself and Abdullah Gondal, why is it that we take a time out of our lives and we talk about these things? Why is it that I created a blog? Why is it that I speak about Islam being false, and I spend my time doing all this activism? And the reason why I do it, to me, like I was actually thought a lot about what you said, and especially when I first left Islam, like, am I doing a disservice to humanity by saying Islam is false? Am I ruining people's lives? Am I undermining something of value that will actually bring ruin to humanity? Like, kind of like, we were saying about, like, we behave as if God, Jordan Peterson said, we should behave, or somebody said we should behave as if God exists, or something like that.
Peterson says that people live, what he said about himself in response to the question, does he believe in if God exists? He responded by saying he lives as though God exists. And he also made the point that Sam Harris, who's clearly self-identifies as atheist, he contends that Sam Harris also lives as though God exists, which is a fascinating point.
So I was definitely thinking about this, as well. And but what I concluded for myself is, especially now, there's different types of believers. I was an Orthodox Muslim, and I mean, some people would disagree with that because I was Salafi during the last probably half of my Islamic life. I converted from a very liberal Islam, which is basically Ismailism, to a version of Islam which was very hardline. But the
And
challenges
very toxic. I mean, I
yeah,
think
so toxic and
before we
how
went before we went live, I mentioned this point. It's unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunate, but we didn't capture this in the live discussion that people are able to see. I made the point that Wahhabi Islam, and I really stand by this, is absolutely, I mean, this is not a value judgment to people who self-identify as Wahhabi, but as a phenomenon,
yeah.
in the world today, is toxic. It is toxic. And
So I don't
to equate Islam, the historic, the incredibly rich, diverse historic intellectual tradition, Islamic intellectual tradition, to Wahhabism is really a big problem. It's a
Yeah.
I applaud you saying that openly. It's very brave.
So I actually have. Sorry, I didn't catch what you said.
I'm just applauding his bravery that calling out Wahhabi Islam for what it is. It's the big thing.
Yeah.
He's saying,
It's very toxic. I mean,
Yeah.
I just have to be honest. It's,
Yeah. And so I also have a blog post about that as well. But I wasn't, so the challenges I had being a Muslim and some of the sacrifices I made were no different than like a so by the way, nobody self-identifies as Wahhabi, by the way. People call themselves Salafi. Nobody says I'm Wahhabi.
This will shock you. Anyone who knows me, has known me for a while. I mention this to them, and they are floored when I tell them this. I used to be Wahhabi many years ago. They're like, you? I'm like, yeah, this is like a lot. So I know from first-hand experience. So
I used to call myself Salafi, but
well, now Wahhabis think they're just being Muslim, right? So Salafis just think they're being Muslim, yeah. So yeah, I was a teenager, wasn't I? And it's the dominant sort of oil money sort of sort of propagated Islam. If anyone wants to be try to be a bit more religious and Muslim, the first thing they're exposed to is Wahhabism, just because of all the bloody oil money.
So what I wanted to say was, like, what I was trying to say was the challenges I faced as a Muslim were not unique because I was a Wahhabi. So, for example, me and my family, I have 5 kids, and I'm married, obviously. Yeah, and so we couldn't buy a house because it was haram, and it was haram to be involved with mortgage, not just for Wahhabis, but for Sunni Muslims who are not Wahhabi as well. So I had a good friend who was a doctor, a psychiatrist. I mean, this guy was making good money, but he couldn't afford to buy a house Islamically because all the halal mortgages were like damn expensive. And so eventually he ended up moving in. Eventually this grown-up man who also has, I think, 6 kids now, ended up moving in with his parents, and they bought a house together. Because of the burden of not being involved in riba. Now, even though the riba system here is actually very effective, the interest system here, you can get a house. My mortgage is 2.5% interest. Now, it's going to go up when I renew it, but it's ridiculously low. Like, I'm paying less for my mortgage than I was paying for a 4-bedroom, big, beautiful house than I was paying for a small 3-bedroom townhouse when I was renting, because it doesn't make sense. Like, when you to avoid interest anyways, a lot of Muslims do involve themselves in interest, but of course there's some guilt there. So that's like one example. In general, I feel like the sacrifices that are made in order to get to Allah's Jannah, avoiding the riba and praying 5 times a day, fasting in the month of Ramadan. In Canada, they're like 17-hour fasts we're talking about. Wow. Like, these are like, I mean, and because you're a Muslim as well, you also had to go through this in Britain as well. Like, these are just as long, right? So like all of these, so the reason I speak about this, and the reason Abdullah Gondal speaks about this, is because it's important to us. We want people to know that Islam is not, like, you don't have to do all this to have a good life. My life has only improved since I left Islam. And so I believe I don't really care if people are atheists or they're not atheists, but I don't want people to live their life in fear of a hellfire, to believe that they're going to be punished if they don't do this and this and this. If somebody wants to be a Muslim and they're a cultural Muslim, they like Eid, they pray once in a while, or they don't pray, but they don't have this fear of hell. I mean, I'm happy for them. I'm like, you're my brother in humanity. I support your right to practice your religion. If you want to wear hijab, it's fine, whatever. I don't have a problem with that. But I do think that it's important for people to know. I believe that Islam, like Muhammad made up Islam. That's what I believe. Whether it was Muhammad or whether it was Muhammad plus the scholars plus the all of the people that Islam or all of the religions are man-made, and they don't come from God, and they had the value, but humanity, we can move forward now whether or not, now that's where there's something to discuss, like whether the humanity will be in more of a loss without religion, or whether there'll be more in a gain without religion. That's something we can debate. But from my perspective as an Orthodox Sunni Muslim, or a Salafi Muslim, if you don't consider that Orthodox, it was a huge sacrifice. It was an immense sacrifice.
I don't think Salafism is Orthodox. I don't.
I know you don't think that. That's what I'm saying. But I'm saying, like, the same sacrifices I made, my Sunni Orthodox Muslim friends were making the same sacrifice. They wouldn't work for banks. They wouldn't get a mortgage like my psychiatrist friend. They were eating only halal meat. Like in fact, some of them wouldn't even eat like Maple Lodge halal, which is like factory slaughtered. They're like, it has to be hand slaughtered. I have friends who used to look at every single box of food they bought and see whether they had gelatin, whether they had mono and diglycerides, and that was me as well.
You're touching on something very important, Abdullah Samir, which is that Muslim scholars, people like Tariq Ramadan, have talked about this, which is do we get caught up in the, we sort of, as a shorthand, right? Do Muslims get caught up in the sort of the letter of the law, right? Without, while missing the deeper meaning behind the law. In the case of slaughter, right? And this is a point that Tariq Ramadan made. This is something that I thought a lot about, and I was vegan for a year before my conversion to Christianity. So there's something I take very seriously and thought a lot about. Like, from as far as I can tell, that there's no way of justifying factory farming from an Islamic ethical point of view. And yet, if you have this discussion about amongst, it's changing now slowly, but not. It's the discussion amongst.
But I don't see that. How do you come up with that? Like, how does Islam stop you from doing factory farming?
Well, so because the ethics of Islam, the way I understand it, Islam, I mean, the Islamic intellectual tradition clearly delineates against, unnecessarily inflicting harm on creatures, right? And factory farming is through and through,
but any meat that you eat, you're killing an animal.
From one perspective, right. From one perspective, so that's the vegan perspective would be that, in which I was vegan for a year, and that's the approach that I took. So these are complex issues, but to your point, that which is that in response to that, the point I'm trying to make here is that missing the spirit of the law, right, for the sake of the, and this is the Christian sort of addendum, right, to what at the time, in Christ's time, from a Christian point of view, the Jewish the sort of the Pharisaic obsession with the letter over the spirit. And this is a human struggle. In other words, this is a human struggle, that why on earth do we do things that we do? Like thinking deeply about why we do things. And I don't think it's just a problem with being Muslim, right?
But isn't that just
a human problem, right?
But isn't this all just humanism? Like all of these enlightened values you're talking about, like for example, being a vegan, taking care of animals, like isn't it just humanism? Like why do we need Islam to tell us that? Like
because we don't necessarily need Islam, but historically speaking, the humanistic values, right? If we look genealogically speaking, they come from, historically speaking, they primarily come from a Christian intellectual spiritual.
Okay. All right. So for example, here, like you're saying that that religion gives a lot of good to society, and you're saying that a lot of humanistic values appear to originate from Judeo-Christian values, right? So
and other traditions, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not denying that religion has value. It definitely gives us a lot of good, but it also gives us a lot of bad. I always say that there's good and there's bad. There's pros and cons. You take the good, you leave the bad. That's the approach I take. But for example, the idea of, for example, free speech or sharing of knowledge or criticism of ideas is very, very essential to progress of any society, right? But when you read the Bible,
to the intellectual health of any society.
Exactly. Yeah. But when you read the Bible, for example, that you, I don't, if you believe it's the word of God, which I assume.
Well, not in the way probably that you think. No, I mean,
dogmatic way. Okay. More of a perennial perspective. Okay. So like this, the Bible in many places labels blasphemy as the unforgivable sin against the Spirit. Then it literally prescribes stoning people to death for blasphemy. And I mean, even in Luke, Matthew, even in the New Testament, it says that blasphemy is the unforgiven sin against the Holy Spirit. Right. So how do you reconcile that with humanistic values that you just endorse of free speech and criticism?
Yeah. No, I think these are very, very important questions. Thank you for posing them. So I again, you know, as a student of history, of philosophy and religion as such, I have to look historically. One has to consider these things historically. So again, I mean, my suggestion would be, just as in the Islamic context, in the Christian context, it's not very different, right? So if we take a text such as the Bible, which is a text, right? It's a compendium of numerous texts, very often contradictory, right, in their own sort of ways. We can't take a text like that in isolation from the interpretive framework that it was understood historically, right? Mm-hmm. So I've been harping on about the historic Islamic intellectual tradition. I could just as easily, and I should, point to the historic Christian intellectual tradition, which is not a singular thing, right? There have been a multiplicity of interpretive communities within the Christian tradition. That's why I'm Eastern Orthodox, for example, versus Catholic versus Protestant, and so on and so forth. And those are just three, you know, broad categories that one could mention in that context. So if we see how the praxis, how historically in practice, and how the great luminaries of the tradition, who spent literally their entire lifetimes dwelling on these texts, dwelling on their contexts as well, right? The text was never divorced from the context, ever, whether in Christianity, whether in Islam, whether in any of these traditions.
So in what context is it okay to stone people who merely want to worship another god? Like it says in Leviticus.
Well, I mean, did that happen? I think that the question is, did that happen, right?
I mean, there's a couple of 3-4 verses in Leviticus, actually. If you want, I can give you the verse number and read it.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that point. My point, however, is that if we look historically, how was it practiced, right? So it wasn't practiced.
It doesn't matter, because it does create an unnecessary fear amongst people to not use
perhaps. I mean, I think it does matter, though, because it matters for this reason, right? That, first of all, the fear that you're referring to, I'm not convinced that, again, so to take a postmodern, you know, Foucauldian take on things, we have to contextualize our own subjectivity, right? Our own subjectivities. So we are modern/postmodern, you know, subjects who have a certain understanding of ourselves and the world and texts and contexts and scriptures and so on and so forth, which is very different from even people who lived 10 yeyears ago. Even from many people who live in other countries around the world today, right? So to respond to your point about people living in fear, so in the Christian context, people didn't even read the Bible, right? I mean, the majority of people didn't even read the Bible, and we can say, well, that in and of itself was a problem, and from one point of view, it was a problem, right? The Christianity that they practiced was mediated to them by the priestly class, right? And this is why we have the Protestant sort of revolt against that, the Reformation against in particular Catholicism, to sort of equalize the playing field, as it were, which opened up a whole other, opened up its own issues. But the point being, I mean, I don't think we're really getting to the crux of the issue if we point to individual verses in any context.
Yeah, I agree with you there, but there was a reality of like witch burning, of the Spanish Inquisition, of like people being killed for like for example, Giordano Bruno and Galileo being persecuted by the church for going against the church doctrine of geocentrism.
And this is a huge problem.
So there is fear. There was a reality that if you converted, if you were against the dominant doctrine of the time, and you see this with Islam and Pakistan and some of the Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, where, and I know you'll say Islamism is a problem, but these things all come from like a flawed text, right? Which is out of place in today's modern enlightened world, and actually, me and Gondal would argue it's bringing more harm than benefit, and it's only enlightened intellectuals like yourself that are stripping away all of the. You can say the Islamic, like Mufti Abu Layth calls it something hermeneutics. What is it called? Projection hermeneutics.
Hermeneutics, yeah.
Yeah, so he's saying the projection is towards reform and getting rid of slavery and all of these things. Like Hamza Yusuf would argue, we don't need to kill apostates today. And these are all really good things. I wanted to ask you a question. What do you think about what Abdullah Gondal and myself are doing? Like talking about Islam. We believe Islam is false, man-made. We say Muhammad made it up. What do you think about that?
Well, so in my conversation with you today,
and sorry, one more thing in specific.
Yeah.
Because we didn't touch about this, Islamophobia. What do you think about what we're doing and the relation to Islamophobia?
Okay, so the first part, if I can go back a little bit more regarding, so Western Christianity is a problem. Historically, it has a lot of blood on its hands.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I've struggled with as someone who self-identifies as Orthodox Christian. I'm not, I'm complicated, as I mentioned to you before. I'm complicated, to put it mildly, right? I confuse myself sometimes, let alone other people, right? So it's, and that's not even a joke. Like I see myself as deeply, deeply rooted in the historic Islamic intellectual tradition. Sometimes see myself as Sufi Christian. I'm influenced by all the traditions. I am who I am. Regardless, as far as so the point of going on that sort of tangent a little bit was to say that from a Christian point of view, something that I've struggled with is the blood that Western Christianity has on its hands, is the blood of colonialism, right? And we all have South Asian roots here, right? It's, colonialism is not something that is of positive, historically speaking, in global, as far as global history is concerned, which was in a very real sense pushed by the Western churches, right, and was complicit in. Now, so that's a problem, and these are problems we have to tackle. At the same time,
I understand if you say that the problem is Western colonialism, and colonialism was pretty bad, but you can only separate Christian tradition from these problems to a certain extent because the verses are in the book itself.
Well, no, I just said, no, this was a problem with Western Christianity, which in many ways propped up colonialism.
Yeah, so...
Right.
Okay. And then
this is the problem. And I will say, nevertheless, the tradition, whether, in this context, Christianity is not reducible to these verses.
Of course,
the Christian experience, as speaking from this perspective as a Christian, my experience of Christ transcends these biblical verses. It is over and above any biblical verse that one can.
The point I was trying to make was not about the specific verse, was about how you were trying to reconcile it by saying it's tied to a specific context. Now, when you tie it to a specific context, you're tying the morality propagated by a certain holy text to a certain time frame in history.
So if I can offer an addendum, which is to say that the text doesn't have any force of its own until it's interpreted a certain way and implemented, right? And this is sort of Foucault's point about power knowledge being inseparable, right? So the two inform each other. So the question is how it's interpreted by certain groups of people at different times, for what reasons, and how they're implemented, right? And I would contend that Christianity, for the most part, notwithstanding the burning of witches, notwithstanding colonialism, to the extent that it was complicit in colonialism, notwithstanding the Crusades, to the extent that brutal massacres were done in the name of Christianity. Notwithstanding those, Christianity has, for the most part, been a force for good in the world. I absolutely believe that. Just as Buddhism, for the most part, notwithstanding, right, the massacre of Burmese Muslims that's been happening now, many people have said it's a genocide. Notwithstanding these horrific things, Buddhism has been
but that has nothing to do with Buddhism. That has everything to do with the nationalistic issues.
You can say that. It's interesting, right? You say that. You see what I'm like?
The reason I say that is because they themselves.
Think about Buddhism as violent, right? Buddhism has a deeply militant history.
No, I know, but the problem.
So if you can say it has nothing to do with Buddhism, why do you come hard on Muslims and say this violence has nothing to do with
I
Islam?
do. Well, I do, because the Muslims that are doing
right.
Well, the reason why is because there's a very there's a very clear distinction between China.
Sure.
Let me explain. Okay, hold on. Let me finish my point.
Sure.
There's a very clear distinction between Chinese oppressing the Uyghurs, the Muslims there, the Burmese oppressing the Muslims in Burma. None of them are quoting the Buddhist holy text and say, terrorize the enemy, kill the disbeliever. Hold on, I'm not done. Just one second. Just give me 1 second. Just give me 1 second. Just give me 1 second. Let me finish my point.
I know what you're saying.
My point is that there's a very straightforward way to get from the Islamic text, a straightforward reading of the Islamic text.
I'm not convinced.
Towards ISIS, to get to ISIS, to get from, basically, it's not just that. We have the Muslim terrorists themselves acknowledging that my inspiration for this is coming from Islam. When you have hold on, I'm not done yet. Let me finish my point. When you have let me finish my point. When you have a well-to-do American, for example, the husband of Tanya Joya, an American-born Muslim that comes from a well-to-do family. His parents are doctors and have a military background. He has no needs in his life. He had no colonialism happening to him. And he went, and his mom bought him a Quran. And he managed to go from that to become one of the leading members of ISIS. He became Yahya al-Burumi. He learned Arabic. He was able to debate the progressives, the modernists, the Muslims, the Orthodox Muslims, and defeat them in polemic arguments using the Islamic doctrine, the Islamic texts themselves. And it was very easy for him to do this because the Hadith corpus and the Quran contain so much rubbish. The idea of martyrdom is essential. Martyrdom and jihad are two things in the Islamic corpus, in the Islamic doctrine, that make it so easy for terrorism to spread. Even it's like a virus that appears in the middle of, and the fact is, the issue of Burma is a political issue that you wouldn't find a Buddhist in, for example, in Canada, coming and saying or like, for example, the Japanese were bombed by America almost into non-existence, but you don't find Japanese today saying Japan Akbar and blowing up buses or going towards, and doing these things, because there's a very clear connection between Islamic. So when you laugh when I say nothing to do with Buddhism, but I don't see the connection to Buddhism, but I do see the connection to Islam. Even the Muslims doing it themselves are telling you this is because of Islam.
I think I want to clarify one thing. What Samir's trying to say is certain texts are conducive to a, let's say, certain interpretation more than another interpretation. For example, it's easier to cherry pick the Quran for violence in it than it is the Bible. The Bible it's easier to find more good things in the Bible than in the Quran.
The New Testament, maybe. Old Testament, I don't know.
No, but what I'm trying to say, that's not the only interpretation. Like, for example, Islam has 10 interpretations, definitely. Is it easier to get to the interpretation of ISIS compared to Sufi Islam? I would say it's definitely easier to generate an ISIS interpretation, or that the Quran lends more towards that, then, for example, say the Bible lends more towards, let's say, jihadism or those sort of interpretations. It's not excluding that there's no Sufi or there's no basis to Sufism. Of course, like I agree that there's definitely, you can interpret texts.
I would even disagree with you there. I wouldn't say one is more likely or one is less likely, because if you look historically, ISIS has been the exception, right? So there's definitely political reasons involved as well. But the fact is that it is possible to get to a pretty damn horrible interpretation of Islam, but you wouldn't find that with like Jane. You know, the typical example that Sam Harris gives, which I know you would disagree with it, is you don't find Jains blowing themselves up. An extreme Jain is like killing himself by fasting to death. He's not blowing himself up and killing other people. So definitely there's some dogma and there's some characteristics that Islam has that can lend itself to these horrible interpretations, right?
So no, thank you both for that. My response, again, I mean, I don't think, you know, as an academic, I hesitate to make, you know, it's not good to make, nor is it honest to make sort of simplistic, you know, statements, right, about anything. Like everything is anything that appears to be simple to us, no matter what it might be, you know, anything is, any human fact that we can see is going to have a multiplicity of complex factors behind it. Now, why do I say that? So if we take the question of terrorism, that's violence that's committed in the name of Islam by Muslims who are justifying their violence based on, you know, hadith texts or Quranic texts, to say that that is only a religious response, I'm not convinced that that's sufficient. You know, my PhD, my doctoral dissertation was on Hizb ut-Tahrir, right? And they're a non-violent organization that wants to bring about, you know, Islamic political ascendancy and so forth. So this is something I've thought a little bit about. Now, to say that in the context of the Burmese Buddhists who have conducted systematically an ethnic cleansing of the Muslims there, to say that that's not religiously motivated, but rather it's a product of the modern nation state. Whereas in the context of the Islamists, right, in whatever context and however they're sort of manifesting their Islamisms, is solely religiously motivated. I'm not sure that that's entirely that's not really getting to the point. And I
agree with you to a
I
certain
shouldn't say solely. I shouldn't say solely. That's not fair either, because human beings never do anything solely for religious reasons, right?
I would agree with Hassan that, yeah, there are other motivations, like political motivations.
If I could finish the thought, if you don't mind, quickly. So, and I think this is a very, very important study on this topic. It's a very important topic, and I've actually literally given this book away, you know, and it's not a cheap book. It's a Columbia University Press book. It's a brilliant analysis. It's called, it's by one of the professors here, Wael Hallaq, W-A-E-L, Hallaq, H-A-L-L-A-Q. His book, The Impossible State, the subtitle is Islam, Politics and Modernity's Moral Predicament. And he's a fascinating scholar in himself. He's a Palestinian Christian, and you know, he's one of the world's leading authorities on the Sharia. And what he argues, he's a brilliant scholar, very brilliant. And his latest work is called Restating Orientalism, which is taking Edward Said's critique even further. He's really in a class of his own, as far as I can tell. And in The Impossible State, what he argues, vis-a-vis the very question that you guys are posing, this is an important question, that we all, you know, especially those of us who come from a Muslim background, whether we self-identify or Muslim or not, we need to think about this and help to educate ourselves and others about this question, right? Because this is a pressing question. That to what extent is Islamism a product of the tradition, the Islamic tradition itself, and to what extent is it influenced by the very mechanics of the modern nation state. And Halak's point, which is, it's a phenomenal, I mean, it's very rare that I come across books, you know, and I'm sure you've had similar experience, which just reading one book, it's like having an education, like a really rich education itself, philosophically, in terms of political theory, in terms of all sorts of things. So the impossible state. So Halak's point is, and he marshals massive amount of evidence, you know, and he's citing, these are all Western, you know, these are Western thinkers he's citing, Foucault not least of all, he's using as well. And he argues very convincingly, the book which came out, if I remember correctly, in 2014, won a prestigious award at Columbia, one of the outstanding books, academic books, to come out of Columbia University Press, right? So that year, he argues that the modern nation state is such, it's speaking of paradigms and ways that our thought is sort of constructed by these unexamined frameworks that I keep harping on about. So he argues that the modern nation state necessarily constricts law, right? And if it's in the context of a Muslim country, it's going to be Islamic law, to the point where it completely depletes the richness of the historic intellectual tradition to very simplistic do's and don'ts. And this is a problem not with the intellectual tradition itself, but it's a problem with the mechanism of the modern nation state.
So would you say it's a toxic mix of modernity and the modern situation that the Muslims find themselves in, plus trying to apply Islam in a way that doesn't fit, or something like that?
I would agree. I think so. This would certainly be my takeaway from Halak. This is a mix, and that the modern nation state, while we, in everyday parlance in mainstream discourses, it's very common, right? It's not uncommon for us to critique Islamism and those forms, clear forms of violations. Not enough is said about the extreme violations that are done in the name of nationalism, right? In the name of, that are done not using religious language, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not religiously framed doesn't mean it's any less
evil,
destructive, right? Things that are done in the name of democracy, right, by the West. And I say this as a Westerner, right? I'm British. And this is my subjectivity is significantly formed by Western modes, and I keep referencing Foucault for a reason, right?
Yeah,
he's one of my great sheikhs, like literally. I mean, I say this without any compunction. Many people will criticize me for that, but whatever.
Yeah.
The Western states, have been for a very long time pursuing these sort of democratizing missions in these uncivilized lands. I mean, this is how the language is this is how it's framed, right? These are barbaric people. They need our civilizational force to come in and change things, right? I mean, this is a problem, right? Things that are done, maybe
totally.
Maybe the intention was originally, I mean, who knows? It's hard to impute intention to people, right? Who am I to say anything?
Yeah, there's definitely harms.
Outcome. It's there was a study published in 2015 by a Nobel Prize winning physicians organization in DC. I forget the name of the organization. There was a lengthy study, and they looked at the deaths that occurred as a result of the war on terrorism, the war on terror, right, by the West since 9/11, and they estimate by conservative estimates, the figure is between 2 million and 4 million civilian lives.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of bad things that nation states have done all over the world.
No one talks about this. Where are the reports on this, right?
Very subtle distinction that needs to be made here is when somebody says something is religiously motivated or not, you have to understand what they mean by that. For example, when you say religiously motivated, you're also making it there's a hidden assertion there, which is not implied. It's covered that Islam is somehow not a political ideology. So what I'm
Islam
trying to
has
say
politics.
is,
There's a political dimension. I
yeah,
mean, human
so
beings are political, right? Human beings
when I,
were political
what,
creatures. Aristotle has described us as political animals, right? So whatever we do will have necessarily a political dimension to
no,
it.
no. Well,
Right.
for example, what I'm trying to say is if there's a religion that's more, for example, spiritual, like Jainism, and a Jain then goes blows himself up and then claims that he's deriving his terrorism from his text, it's harder to accept. But when you look at Islam and its history and how it grew and expanded, if, for example, take Muhammad's life, right? Himself, the Quran is also going to inflict terror in the heart of the enemy. Muhammad saying many times that I was helped by inflicting terror into the heart of the enemy, and so on and so forth. His whole life, like he had like 50 some campaigns in his life. Out of that, 96% were proactive first launched attacks by Muslims, right? So when you look at the political aspect of Muhammad's life, it's easier to derive political motivations, even in this modern age, from Islam rather than, say, from religion. At the same time, in the 6th century, that was less political and more spiritual. You understand?
Right. Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. No, I think that's not an unfair, sort of suggestion. Now, I would respond perhaps by, I'm not a scholar of Jainism. I don't really know much at all about Jainism other than to say.
Just a point, yeah, exactly.
Right, no, but
Non-violent
I think that maybe in this context, a more applicable, appropriate example would be to use the example of Christianity, right? So, and to go back to my point also about Aristotle's description of us as being political animals. We are political, just this is what it means to be a human being, and something. It depends on how we define politics, right? But and there's sort of complex, very, very complicated evolutionary reasons for these things. Nevertheless, my point being, so if we take, one could say, right, the sort of mainstream take on Christ, right, or Jesus, the historic person, is that he was a peaceful guy, right? I think it's more than that, of course, but to use that description, he was a peaceful guy who essentially, wanted to create, he basically headed a rebellion, right, in a Roman occupied land, and he paid the price by giving his life, right, on the cross. And of course, from a Christian point of view, I mean, for me, that's a very, very sort of attenuated analysis of that. But nevertheless, if we use that example, and this is the comparison that is often set up,
Muhammad versus Christ.
The example of Jesus versus the example of Muhammad, right? Now, I would respond by saying that how was it, again, what has history shown us, right? So the Romans very quickly, after initial persecution, extreme persecution of the early Christians, they adopt Christianity, right? Which is a fascinating historical fact, right? That we can't get away from. And then
Islam, funny thing.
Pardon?
It's the same with Islam. Like the Arabs, they wanted to kick out Muhammad, and then in the end, they all became Muslim, right?
Which I'm not sure can be explained away by sort of simple sociological explanations or psychological explanations.
I think it is. It can be.
No, I wouldn't be surprised that you think it is, but I think human beings, again, we're multi-level, right?
Yeah.
There's gradations of meaning and understandings of things that the complexity of what it means to be like. Why do you believe the things that you believe, right? Why do I believe the things that I believe?
But I do think that Islam has certain characteristics that made it spread. Like one is the fact that laws of attrition. So, for example, leaving Islam, there's a penalty for leaving Islam. 2 is the evangelical nature of Islam, dawah and all that. And 3 is the rules of jihad. Like all of these rules.
Studies have been made. This is a very interesting. Again, from a Christian point of view, this is uncomfortable for me. As a scholar, one has to learn to live with conflicting ideas. That's what it means to think right outside the box, or to try to think more broadly speaking. So from a Christian point of view, this is troubling for me to note, and this has been noted by many academics over a long time now, that the idea that is very often mentioned, that Islam was spread by the sword, is actually historically not accurate. In fact, the boot was on the other foot vis-a-vis Christianity. Christianity was actively spread by the sword, by killing people unless they converted to Christianity. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, there's a book which is over 100 years old now, written by Sir Thomas Arnold, he was an Englishman, called The Spread of Islam. And he notes how, and all of which is to say, look, I don't really have a horse in any of these, in Islam per se, or Christianity per se, or Buddhism, or I'm really interested in trying to get to, let's have a broader appreciation of things, right? The reality is much more complicated than we think. I'm not convinced that Islam, historically speaking, was as violent as we are oftentimes led to believe. The historical facts simply do not bear this out. There were Christians sort of under the Roman occupation, right? Who actually, historically speaking, Sir Thomas Arnold points this out, many Muslims were invited by the subjugated populations, who were subjugated by the Roman Empire, to come liberate them from the Roman Christians, which is fascinating historic fact. It's very, very complex. The picture's
I would add just a little bit of nuance, is that I wouldn't say Islam is spread just by the sword or just without the sword. We can't limit just to these two options, right? I see the history of Islam, or the spread of Islam, is in phases. For instance, the initial expansion in the Arabian Peninsula was more militaristic, military campaigns. But then you come to a phase in Islamic history, in a tradition maybe, if, for example, the spread of it in Indonesia or the eastern part of the world, Southeast Asia, was not expanded by military. So that's it varies what point and what time in history and what circumstances surround a certain religion, For example, Jesus himself was not spreading his message or going on military campaigns. So by looking at his life, you can say that he was definitely way more pacifist than, let's say, you compare to Muhammad, who was leading campaigns upon campaigns after moving to Medina.
So this is how it's usually presented to us, but it's
wasn't early Islam spread by the sword? Sorry to just jump in there, but for example, Khalid bin Walid, the early empires of Islam, it grew so quickly with jihad. Muhammad was sending letters to all of these rulers all over the place saying, pay the jizya. Either accept Islam, pay the jizya, or fight. And these were the three choices that he gave. And he said if they pray, for example, there's letters of his or hadith that say that, watch them, and if there's the adhan called, then don't invade. But if they don't,
can I put it to you this way? And I'm not trying to evade the question. I'm trying to make a wider point, as you'll see. How does that differ from Western incursions in Eastern lands today? Right, in the name of capitalism, in the name of neoliberalism, in the name of.
I totally agree.
I'm not saying it does, but
So my point being, what we have here, and I'm not just. My larger point is violence in any shape or form. Not to say one violence is better than the other or more justifiable than the other, right?
Yeah.
Violence is a human problem.
Yeah.
And we have to. I'm not convinced that we've quite figured out how to deal with violence as a human problem.
Yeah, and that's the reason why it manifests so often in religions as well, because it's a human thing, and when religions are made by humans, they tend to reflect.
I would respond by saying that the biggest violations that are happening today are being done not in the name of religion. It's being done in the name of ideologies. The bloodiest century that humanity has ever seen, which was the previous century, and this century is already shaping up to be even bloodier, was the 20th century. More bloody, more people lost their lives in the 20th century than all all of human history combined prior to that.
Yeah, of course.
Unthinkable. And these
But
were
yeah.
not
But also the proportion of people alive, right?
And there's
Also,
more the technologies, right? We can like kill each other with a button now.
Yeah, we have to also consider.
I really believe that if anything, religion in its best of forms, right, however we understand it, traditional religion, of course, again, I want to emphasize that religion as a category needs to be expanded, but stick with the traditional mainstream understanding of religion, the definition. Religion, for the most part, plays in its better forms and interpretations a humanizing role. Historically, it's a fascinating fact that I forget which Pope Pius the 11th.
But then why don't we just go to humanism? Because that's the goal, right? Like, why do we need all of this false dogma?
I'm not convinced that humanism has provided us with the answers, and I'm not convinced by the category of false and true either. So something more effective in improving our quality of lives, or it's not. That's my measure, right?
Okay.
So what's going on, in my opinion,
so let me very quickly so Pope Pius XI, it may have been him, but he actually forbade. No, to your point, Abdullah Samir,
Yeah.
he actually forbade the use of crossbows because his understanding was like combat had to be man to man, right? And he felt that it was unethical for people to be fight. That's a crossbow. Right now we have drones.
Yeah.
And soon we're going to automate.
Yeah, but how is that coming from religion? I don't like religion is you're forbidding crossbows.
No. This is to my point that religion, if anything, the better forms, the more
humanistic ones,
the more humanizing. No. Well, humanism only exists because of religion. Look at it this way.
How's that?
Why is it wrong to kill? Why is it wrong to kill a human being?
Well, it's arbitrary, but we decided that we are the most.
The question that needs to be asked is, what's the point of religious morality? Is religious morality meant or intended to better the lives of humans at a societal and individual level, or is it about not incurring the wrath of a specific deity? Because that's a very, very important motivation for both moral frameworks. For example,
that's a good point.
Make an a priori assumption that morality should be about making the human experience as good as possible at an individual and societal level.
As good as what? I didn't catch that last part.
Individual and societal level, like as collective as a species.
As good as possible.
Yeah, whereas religious morality tends to show that it's not always about what's best for humans. It's also mostly about what God likes or doesn't like.
I.e. blasphemy, right? That's a good example. It hurts nobody, but in some cases it deserves death.
Right. Well, so I mean, look, again, it's to sort of complicate the narrative, right? To broaden the discussion. I'm really interested, in these are human problems, right?
Yeah.
We may not call these blasphemy laws anymore in the West, but it's not as though one can say anything one wants about anything under the sun. Right now, what's happening with Ilhan Omar, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so there are some things that cannot be said.
Yeah,
right?
but the difference there is,
I'm not sure there is a difference.
No, but she's not being killed for that. She
may
lose her position.
She's being politically assassinated.
Yeah,
right?
I agree with you. Actually, I don't like.
Happens on there are different types of, and this is Foucault's point, discipline and punishment.
Yeah, but there's a political agenda behind what's happening with her, right? I mean, it's not like
animals, right?
Huh?
There's always a political agenda with political animals, right?
Yeah.
And the question, where do we fit into?
Gondal, sorry, I wanted to hear what you had to say as well.
I haven't been following Ilhan Omar's.
Okay. No, but
But I had just one thing to add is what I notice, or the way I see human morality, is humans tend to have a very idealistic or utopic sense of how reality ought to be.
Yes.
They don't realize that we actually live in a reality that is very imperfect or far from perfect.
Right.
And we want, now, for example, like the arbitrariness or like take sexuality, for example. It is such a trivial, animalistic, and subjective thing. But for some reason, we want some objective laws for something so subjective, and we want like this creator of the universe telling us exactly what to do, when we have this perception of having a perfect answer to everything in every situation. But in fact, we have to understand that it just doesn't exist, because we live in an imperfect, or let's say what appears to be a very chaotic and a weird reality. So we should expect that our answers aren't always going to be perfect.
No, I think these are all very, very, I mean, literally, I think all the different topics that we've discussed, that we touched on today, literally, books can be written on each of these topics. No, these are vast topics. And very important. The question of sexuality is not a small thing, right? And religions historically, human societies, we should say, and anthropologists have been writing about this for a very long time. Human societies as such have always had rules, societal rules about, terms of engagement, who can have sex with whom, who is related to whom, and from a sort of sociological point of view, Emil Durkheim and all the great sociologists, anthropologists have written a lot about this, and this is part and parcel. And this is the tension, right? I think this is the human tension. On the one hand, to use this sort of metaphysical, somewhat theologically inclined language, if we are spirits in a physical body, which from a theological, metaphysical point of view, that's the position I take. So the spirit, which is by definition infinite, right? Whether we accept it or not, but definitionally, right? It's infinite. Is enclosed, is encased in this physical dimension, which is by definition limited. So we're always going to have this tension between the unlimited and the limited, and how that manifests. The reason why I mention this. So how this manifests in the human experience, sociologically speaking, this is a tension, right? On the one hand, sex, right, the act of having sex, and Sufis have written extensively about how the sexual experience is a powerful metaphor for the experience of the divine itself, right? Rumi writes about this, Christian mystics have written about this, all the mystics, I love mystics for that reason. Well, not only for that reason, but that's one of the reasons. So human sexuality is this extremely potent force in the world. We literally, through sex, through a man and a woman, we have the potential of bringing another life into the world. I mean, that is mind-blowing, right? It's beyond comprehension. And you're both fathers. I'm a father as well. I mean, it doesn't make. I mean, I did something, and now I have a son who's 9, so the point being, like, it's a potent force in the world which can
be used for good or bad. Yeah.
Which can be used for good or bad, which factually speaking has real world sociological implications, right?
Definitely.
And the question is, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I mean, it's part of the mechanism for human societies to actually function. There have to be some laws by which we agree to conduct our sexual relations. And we have unspoken rules which are still being figured out right now in liberal societies, right? Like what are the rules of sexual engagement? This is a big question, right? That the right, no less, is raising vis-a-vis the left, where the left, these are complicated issues, and I'm not convinced that we have improved on anything that's gone before. We're trying to figure stuff out.
Like the way I look at it, for example, like, and I'll pose this as a question indirectly as well, that it made sense in the past for our sexuality to be more policed because of lack of birth control and the high risk of STIs and stuff, right? But now we are at a point where, due to advancements in science and medical sciences, we have modern birth control and ways to prevent STIs and stuff.
Sure.
So if somebody now wants to have sex for pleasure, for example, to adults, why is it morally wrong, or why should we view their act in the light of, for example, a text that was written 2,000 years ago.
Or even LGBT, like for example, same-sex marriages. You know, I just want to say thank you to Jon Snow. I just got a donation from him. I just want to say thank you once again. He comes almost on every single show and gives donations. I very much appreciate that. Thank you so much, Jon Snow. Yeah, and including LGBT rights and stuff like that, which many Christians have a problem with. Some Christians don't even want to bake cakes for like gay couples, right?
So I'm doing well. I think these debates, these discussions again. So I'm going back to England soon. I think I mentioned to you before, not in this conversation, but I'm foreshortening an MDiv, a Master's in Divinity, that I started after my conversion experience to Christianity at Union Theological Seminary, which is right next to Columbia, and it's a very liberal institution. It's a Christian institution, and they have a very, what we would call a liberal understanding of gay rights and these issues. And historically speaking, you know, I'm just factually speaking, right? Homosexuality existed in Muslim societies. This is an old thing. This is nothing new. I think, you know, as far as the rules are concerned, to your question, Abdullah Gondal, that why bother with these rules, right? If we have you know, modern birth control and so disease prevention and so forth. Well, I mean, I'm not convinced that we've done any better, right? I mean, teenage pregnancy is at an all-time high, right? Sexually transmitted illnesses are very, very prevalent. I mean, and I'm not saying these rules are necessarily the only way to go, but it seems to be the case that having these rules, you know, forestalled certain other problems. Like we have a whole, like we've opened up another can of worms that, as a species, especially in the West, but increasingly in the rest of the world, right? Whatever happens in the West inevitably happens has its echoes in the rest of the world, right? The West and the rest. That's how we tend to think of these things, which is problematic in itself. But nevertheless, these are issues that we haven't. You know, rape. I mean, women.
Actually, that's a great example, because the Quran and the Sunnah and religion in general, never mind, doesn't talk, not religion. When I say religion, I'm talking about Christianity and Islam. Not only does it not mention rape, but it mentions marrying your adopted son's ex-wife for the Muslims, just in case you need to know you can do that. It also doesn't mention marital rape, which is a much more subtle case of rape in general. So how is religion, again, bringing any value? I know people that are like gay and living their life as married, like they're married to the opposite sex, and they're pretending that they're happy, but they're not happy because they're actually gay and they're just doing it. They lied to their spouse, they lied to their family, they're lying to everybody around them. I know one example of a Somali that he's ex-Muslim now, but he left Islam, but he attempted, I think, twice to get married, and in both cases he ended up divorced because he just couldn't do it. But he really tried. He really wanted to fix his gayness because of, like you said, historically, you know, there were homosexual Muslims and whatever. But again, if you go back to the interpretation, the straightforward reading of the Quran and Sunnah, homosexuality is forbidden. It's cursed by Allah. And I'm not just talking about Wahhabis. I'm talking about Hamza Yusuf. I'm talking about mainstream Sunni scholars have all condemned homosexuality. Hamza Yusuf said the solution for homosexuality, and by the way, I have to apologize. It's almost 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We've been going on for a very long time, and I know you must be getting tired. All of us are probably. And so I apologize for that. It's gone on and on and on. You've also been double teamed, 2 against 1.
So my teacher, I jokingly and not so jokingly, I used in our conversation, you know, behind the scenes about my sheikh. My sheikh in this regard is Joe Rogan. I love that dude, and he regularly has 3-hour-long conversations, like these discussions, and he's phenomenal. But anyway, I'm grateful for that, and no, that's wonderful.
Samir, just because this discussion is going towards the moral side, I just want to know one thing.
Yeah.
Because I see that, Hassan, are you more of a moral relativist than a moral absolutist in terms of morality?
I simply put, I don't know if there's a simple response to that question. I don't like labels. I mean, I think just, and that's not to avoid the question. That's not to avoid the question because, in my experience, in my studies, reality is so complex, right? What may be right for me, just on a physiological level, medically speaking, something may medically work for me, and this, all the research is now, showing, pointing to this, could be completely wrong for someone else with similar symptoms, right?
Definitely.
And historically speaking, this is an interesting fact that many Muslims don't realize, tragically, it's a big problem, that the Sharia, for instance, I mean, it's a crazy shift maybe on one level, but the Sharia historically was always not only contextualized to the community, but contextualized to individuals. The fatwa that were pronounced by local qadis. And this is a point
was it Imam Malik that said that I would give one fatwa in one region, but give the opposite fatwa in another region? Was it one of the great imams said that?
That doesn't surprise me. I mean, this has historically been the case. So, and to your point, to Abdullah Samir's point about Hamza Yusuf and others, I mean, again, to speak to the complexity of the, the granular nature of human, living and experience. So just as there are countless gay, self-identified gay Christians, gay and lesbian Christians, and proud to be so, there are many, many increasingly self-identified gay and lesbian Muslims, and that may not be palatable, and often isn't palatable to the likes of Hamza Yusuf, but
to the likes of the Muslim community in general, because it's clear, as clear as day in the Quran, that Lot was,
No, I mean, I don't. I mean, there's someone like he teaches at I forget.
Institute.
Who? Sorry.
Hamza Yusuf you're talking about?
Oh, no, I'm not thinking of Hamza Yusuf. I'm thinking of Scott Kugel. So Scott Kugel is a self-identified. He's an academic, and Muslim academic convert, gay, and he argues, and this is his argument, and this factually this is the case, right? He argues from an Islamic point of view how homosexuality can be justified. So I mean, I
would love to hear those arguments, because honestly, from the Quran, I cannot fathom. Like I've debated, not debated, but I've heard a progressive Muslim try to defend homosexuality by saying that the Quran story about Lot and also the Bible story about Lot was about rape and not about homosexuality. But the problem is there's a huge fatal flaw with that argument, which is that it makes no sense that the Prophet Lot was giving his daughters to rapists rather than giving his daughter.
So Scott Kugel is the last time I checked, an associate professor, if not full professor at this point. He's a serious thinker. He's not, he teaches at Duke.
But it's not. These are not orthodox opinions. These are like.
What is orthodox? What is orthodox? Sorry?
There's a more fundamental point that I'm coming back to constantly in my mind is, in the Quran, it constantly says that, and it blames the Christians and the Jewish rabbis that they made halal what was deemed haram by God. Now the problem is when it comes to morality, you obviously yourself admit that morality should not be stagnant. It should evolve as time evolves because the needs of the time change, right?
Well, so morality differs from context to context. I mean, this is a well-known principle in the Shariat context, just to this very point, very quickly, that, for instance, certain circumstances can make what would, under other circumstances, be forbidden, make them permissible, and vice versa. So, it's well known that pork, is not to be eaten by Muslims, right? And if one needs, and this is an extreme example, but by way of illustration, if need be, one can eat pork. Alcohol is not supposed to be consumed, but Muslims drank all the time and medicinally used and so forth. So these things are always contextual.
Now, what I'm coming to is, what standard are the scholars using that is objective in and of itself to then make these judgments that something that is haram is now halal and something halal is now haram? Because
right. So I remember. So this is these are very, very important questions, and I want to emphasize. my gratitude to you guys for posing these questions, and they're very pointed questions. So I enjoy this.
This is the favorite expression of Zakir Naik. Brother asks a good question. So you are standing on the shoulder of giants, in the shadow of giants.
I can't believe you just. I never thought anyone would. I don't think you'd compare me to Zakir Naik, but I'm Zakir Naik.
Kidding. Honestly, that was a total joke. You're in no way anywhere like Zakir Naik.
He's anyway.
I was just being funny. I didn't mean it.
No, I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate the joke. So what was I going to say?
Sorry, I ruined it with the joke.
No, you didn't ruin it. Now, so wait,
we're talking about what standard do the scholars use that is an objective in itself to make more relativistic judgments?
Well, so this is the thing. Historically, Muslim jurists could be labeled as being moral relativists, which is an interesting conceit. Put it this way, and I heard the story many, many years ago from Hamza Yusuf, whom I have sort of, he's very influential and understanding so, and he has limitations. So anyway, he's a human being like all of us. Nevertheless, I remember him mentioning that, I forget the example of this scholar, but it's some famous scholar, way back when, and it was, he was saying that it was said of his knowledge that it was so vast that, people would complain about so-and-so doing weird things and, which they couldn't fathom, like Abdullah, you said they can't fathom, right? That they couldn't fathom how they could be justified in doing it. And the scholar would respond, oh, he or she must be following such and such opinion. So in other words, right, the Islamic intellectual tradition, like any of these intellectual traditions, right, any of these really intellectual traditions, is so vast that, the question of, what applies to whom and when is really an open question, and anyone who says otherwise, anyone who says this is what Islam is, this is what Christianity is either deluded or unintelligent or just hasn't really studied.
So, but when you talk about orthodoxy, like you said, what is orthodoxy? And you said, Wahhabis are not orthodox. They're not orthodox Muslims by any means.
I did say that.
But there is a definition of orthodoxy. We're talking about the four madahib, Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali. According to the classical interpretation of the scholars, no classical scholar would ever say that homosexuality is allowed. And the analogy you made to eating pork when you're starving and gonna die, I mean, you're never gonna be compelled to have anal sex. That's just something that's never gonna happen, right?
I mean, that was an extreme. Just to kind of illustrate a point, right? So I think, what do I think? So I'm getting a little tired here. So
yeah. Let's get this finished up as well and make some concluding remarks.
But this is important. So if you can backtrack a little bit, I'm literally I just felt a shift where I just felt my energy go down.
While you're having a sip of water, I just want to say thank you for the second donation. We must be doing something right because I got 2 donations now from Alina A. Thank you so much for the $10.
I think let's make concluding remarks. Wrap it up. It's been almost 3 hours now.
This is
right.
Yeah. So I think what we have to also recognize that if we read the fiqh sources, right, by these great jurists, men and women, right? So they're usually men, but also the phenomenal women scholars throughout Muslim history. They would make pronouncements, and they would very often, in their books, sort of bemoan the state of the Muslims. They'd say, "Oh my God, Muslims have gone to hell," not literally, but I mean that's kind of the language. They'll say, what is wrong with Muslims, because they had these idealized understandings of things, and then there was the reality on the ground, or the realities on the ground, right? And so, I mean, look, Muslims are human beings like everyone else. I gave a lecture last Saturday, actually, on Islam and music, and my audience, they're all Christian, they're all Christian. I had next to no exposure, very limited exposure to Islam and Muslims prior to that. And one of the concluding things I said was this, that Muslims are, humans like everyone else. There are all sorts of Muslims. all types, right? And they're just really trying to do the best that they can, like everyone else, right? We're all trying to make sense of this complex, painful, and sometimes, oftentimes painful, oftentimes at the same time very beautiful reality that is life. And we just have different frameworks through which we try to make sense of things. And these frameworks may not necessarily make sense to many people from the outside, right? But if we seek to, and I say this to my mother, right? My mother's a very religious Muslim, right? And she has issues with my Christianness, right? And she can't make sense of it. Like, this is a reality, this is a lived reality for me, right? Not unlike perhaps in ways fit for yourselves. Now, I'll say to her, look, Amma, I say Amma in Bengali, Christianity is a deeply, deeply rich tradition, which I know from having studied it, from having now practiced it. And some of the things that I say to my mum when she, says, well, really, it's about Islam. It's Islam or nothing, right? Kind of, to paraphrase her. I'll say to her, Amma, well, many Christians say the same thing. And there are Christians. I mean, I was thinking of one example, a professor who's doing great doing great work in terms of bridging the divide and creating awareness amongst Christians vis-a-vis Islam. And I was saying, Christians who've actually studied the tradition, they realize the deep beauty of the tradition. And it's not a contradiction. So in order to understand any worldview, we're talking about worldviews, right? These are sort of cosmologies, to use that old word, right? That these are ways that we literally make sense of the cosmos, right? We're not going to, unless we really immerse ourselves in them, right? Whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's neuroscience, right? I mean, you wouldn't give the person the time of day, right? Abdullah Gondal, right? If the person did, I mean, just factually speaking, this is how the disciplines work. Like, to make pronouncements on neuroscience if they hadn't actually studied it, right? And we should have the same standards when it comes to talking about what I believe are even more important concerns, right? How we live our lives, how we relate to each other, how we view ourselves in the world.
Pragmatically
and metaphysically, right? The pragmatic aspect is in a real sense, I think, secondary to the metaphysical side of things, right? And we're all a part of it, right? We're all influenced by each other, right? And we all have to do the best that we can to live with each other on this boat, right? This human ship that we're all occupying right now, which can be called planet Earth, right? It's swimming, in this universe, right? I mean, we either all survive, right, together, despite our differences, or because of our differences, or we go down, right? And I'm certainly, just like yourselves, of course, I'm all for working through this together.
Right?
I think that's beautifully said. What you said, we're all in this, this one boat that we have to all somehow find ways to live together. And Abdullah Gondal, do you want to add anything? Because honestly, I do think you said some really, really interesting things. It's quite fascinating that how different this chat with you is compared to the one that we did a year ago. It's so you're so different now in the way that you're communicating. Yeah, and let's have another one at some point. But yeah, do you want to make any concluding remarks? Because
I would just want to present how I view religion.
Okay.
In my worldview, I know that humans have this huge imagined self-importance about themselves being unique and stuff, but also at the same time, when I look at the cosmos, I see that the cosmos has been around for 14 some billion years. And before us, there are 5 different iterations of life and mass extinction events, right? And eventually we came to pass. Now, when our ancestors opened their eyes, they were sincerely trying to make sense of reality. Okay, their efforts were sincere. That's how religion came to be. And I honestly don't blame them with the answers they came up to be, no matter how ludicrous it was, because they just had very, very limited knowledge. Then you see this pattern emerge where as our knowledge increases, we replace supernatural explanations with more naturalistic explanations, and it's continuing this way. Now, what strikes me here is like I definitely understand the value religion did bring, and it was at a point necessary or maybe even conducive to more survival and keeping humans together at a point in history. It did help. What we also need to understand is something that worked maybe 1,000 years before might not work the same way or as effectively now because of how our needs and how our knowledge has changed. To give you an idea, like most of us nowadays, if we resurrect a 10th century Christian or 10th century Muslim, we would find them utterly ignorant about how reality works. For example, like they would not know that the earth is probably a globe or not, or is it flat or not. We would not take their opinions on hygiene or medical science, or mostly of anything. And we know this because we know how ignorant they were. But when it comes to the most important question about existence and why we exist, or is there a God or not, we are blindly accepting what they're saying, but rejecting almost everything else what they say about reality. So this is how I view religion. I see that there are phases in humanity where people come to stark realization, or there's sudden increase in knowledge. For example, what happened in the past 200 years, and we're in this phase where we are evolving past our religions. Like the religions of today, no matter how confident they might seem, eventually will become like the religions of the past, like the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans. And the way, like as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, it's just a one-way street, and you see this pattern of religions being more and more irrelevant in society. And like I said, I acknowledge the benefit religion has had and the positives it has. We have to also acknowledge the negatives it's given to society. But as I said, it's a very human thing. And that's why you see these humanistic traits manifest in religions all the time. And the mere fact that there's like 4,000 different religions, and there's like every society you look at has a religion. It's almost like every different part of the world has a different cuisine or a different type of food. It's almost like that. Every society has had some spirituality. In the end of the day, we need to acknowledge the values, the pros and cons of it, take what's good, leave out what's bad. We cannot be like there are atheists that say the religion is complete useless, is complete poison. I do not agree with that. There's a lot of benefit to be had, and it has shaped the way society is. But at the same time, you have to be intellectually honest about the negatives. And religion is just one step or one phase of society evolving to and not something else with more knowledge. That's how I view religion. And I'd say I've noticed that a lot of atheists are very, very dismissive of religion, and I would also say that they shouldn't be like that. As of myself, I'm also an agnostic atheist in the sense that I don't necessarily say that there cannot be a God. There can be a God. I think people should still be open to the idea, and then also our idea and our concept of what a God is has evolved so much compared to what it was, for example, 3,000 years ago. Compared to now, from anthropomorphic deities like in the Romans and the Greeks, Zeus, to now slowly you see this trend from physical objects, God, from stones and rocks, God went in the clouds, from the clouds, God is now outside the cosmos and has become more of an invisible being. So hopefully people are more honest. I think a lot of people need to look into tradition like Buddhism, like you said, Hassan. It's so rich. And I was reading some Buddhist books that were written at the same time, contemporaries of Muhammad in the 6th century. And when you read those books, and I'm studying yours, I'm like, wow, these people were onto something, So, like I said, take the good, leave the bad, except that we have to understand that our knowledge, our brains evolved to survive on a planet, and maybe not to understand everything about reality. So we have to admit our own ignorance when we say that, for example, say, oh, Christ made the world, or Allah made the world. There are things that we just can't be sure about. To me, religion pretends to be sure about things that no human can possibly be sure of or make claims with any sort of confidence. And one thing I've noticed constantly is religious people tend to make claims that don't scale to their evidence. And I think if people understand that your claims should scale to your evidence, it will help society a lot. I think that's all from me. I think it's
That's wonderful.
That was amazing. Hassan, I just want to say thank you. Honestly, this was an amazing conversation. I somehow had the idea that we disagreed a lot more than maybe we did, than maybe it appeared that we did. But I do find your perspective on religion quite refreshing.
Yeah.
I honestly wish that more people would take, whether Christianity or Islam, the way you do. I believe we're all on the same side, we're all in the same boat, as you put. I sincerely believe that you are an ally of us, that you're all about, you are coming at this from the same perspective of goodness, of what would be good for humanity, what does humanity need, what's going to help us to survive, and what's going to reduce teenage pregnancies, as an example you said, right? And STIs or whatever, right? And so I really do find the way that you look at religion as a scholar, an academic, like much needed in the world today, compared to even someone like Hamza Yusuf or Yasser Qadhi or Bilal Phillips or any of these Orthodox / Wahhabis or whatever you want to call them. They fall into different parts, but honestly, I do appreciate this was a great conversation. I'm glad that you and Abdullah Gondal connected and we had this. We can do another one at some point. We still missed a bunch of points which I wanted to talk about, but it's okay because it's 3 hours.
Time for more, but
these are sorry, you're going to say. I was just going to say these are all. I mean, again, to sort of repeat myself, but I think it bears repeating. The different topics that we were able to at least touch upon today, literally.
A book can be written on religion.
A book and more could be written on each and every one of these, and there are books that do exist on these topics. So no, let's. I certainly believe absolutely, fundamentally, in the importance of discussion and debate and dialogue, because that's what's the point otherwise. And I look forward to discussions. And
just a few closing remarks. Like, I really appreciate your views on religion. You're like the most unorthodox Orthodox Christian.
That's probably true, yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate it, and I feel like we need more academics like you with more nuance, more that'll bring more to the discussion from a different angle, and I really appreciate, we actually enjoyed this discussion a lot, because like when you talk to somebody that's dogmatic, like if you're talking to a Maulvi or like a Mullah or like a strict staunch Salafi or even a dogmatic Christian, it's really hard to talk to them, especially being an atheist. Well, with you, I could connect, and you understood us and we understood you, and it was
thank you.
A pleasure. Like, I'm honored to talk to you, obviously.
Likewise, really, likewise. And this is, I live for this kind of engagement, and really, if we, my sort of hope is, that we can reach more people with more nuanced discussions about things. We all benefit from it, right? Look, I mean, I live to learn. Learning is certainly one of my primary motivations in life, and so this has been an extremely enriching. And a great learning experience. So thank you both for your time. And
amazing. Well, until next time, it's
we continue.
Good night from my side.
Good night. Thank you.